Abigail Turner picked up the cast-iron skillet with both hands and hurled it straight through the frosted window. Glass exploded outward into the Wyoming cold. The sound cracked across the yard like a gunshot. 3 ranch hands spinning around. A woman standing at a broken window in a dead kitchen nobody had used in 15 years, chest-heaving flour still on her hands from the bread she'd been baking alone since before sunrise. She wasn't throwing it in rage. She was throwing it because the handle had finally snapped clean off the 3rd piece of equipment that had broken on her in 2 days. And if she set it down gently, she was going to sit on the floor of that filthy stone building and cry until she couldn't breathe. And Abigail Turner had promised herself the day she buried her mother that she would never do that again. She pressed her knuckles against the window frame, took one breath. Then she bent down, picked up the skillet from the snow outside, walked to the workbench, and started figuring out how to fix it. That was who she was. That was who they'd underestimated. If you've ever been handed someone's leftovers and expected to be grateful, this story is for you. Stay with me all the way to the end and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. If it moves you, subscribe to this channel and hit that bell so you never miss what comes next. The day Abigail Turner arrived at Blackstone Ranch, she was carrying everything she owned in a single canvas bag that wasn't even full. That was the part nobody mentioned later when the stories started getting told. They talked about what she built. They talked about what she survived. They talked about the winter and the feast and the night everything came apart in front of 100 witnesses. But nobody talked about that canvas bag. Nobody talked about the fact that a 32-year-old woman with capable hands and a mind sharp as a skinning knife had arrived at the biggest ranch in Laramie County with less than what most men packed for a weekend drive. She hadn't always been this way. There had been a house once, a root cellar her father built with his own hands, a garden her mother tended from the moment the frost broke every spring until the first hard freeze of fall. There had been warmth and bread smells, and the sound of her parents talking low to each other after supper, the way people talk when they've built something together and they know it. Then the fever came through. It didn't take them both at once that would have almost been kinder. It took her mother first in March, when the ground was still too frozen to dig properly. Then it circled back and took her father in May, right when the garden should have been going in. Abigail had nursed them both one after the other until there was nobody left to nurse and nothing left to tend. The land went to debts she didn't know existed. The house went with it. 2 neighbors came by with food and sympathy, and one of them mentioned carefully, like she might break, that there was work available at Blackstone Ranch west of Cheyenne, that Cole Blackstone was known for running a fair operation, that they needed someone who knew how to manage provisions. She'd taken the work because there wasn't anything else. She'd taken it without asking what the pay was, or where she'd sleep, or whether the people there were decent. You don't negotiate when the canvas bag is already packed and there's nowhere to go back to. The wagon ride out took most of a day. The driver was a quiet man named Stu, who chewed tobacco and occasionally pointed at landmarks without explaining what they were. By the time the ranch came into view, the main house up on a rise, outbuildings spreading down the slope, cattle moving in the far pastures like slow dark shapes against the brown grass. The sun was already low, and the wind had picked up with a bite in it that promised an early winter. She climbed down from the wagon and stood in the yard holding her canvas bag and waited. A woman came out of the main house before anyone else. She was maybe 45, dressed well with the kind of posture that comes from spending a lot of years reminding people who you are. She looked Abigail over the way you'd look at a horse someone was trying to sell you, assessing unimpressed, already calculating the discount. "You're the one from Cheyenne," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am, Abigail Turner." "I'm Dorothea Crane. I'm Mr. Blackstone's cousin, and I manage the household." She paused just long enough to make the pause mean something. "You're heavier than I expected." Abigail held the woman's gaze. "I expect I am. The last woman they sent us was at least presentable." Dorothea folded her hands in front of her. "Mr. Blackstone isn't available. He doesn't concern himself with staffing arrangements. I'll be the one deciding whether you stay." Understood. You cook. Yes, ma'am. Preserve. Yes. Can you manage inventory supply records because the last girl we had couldn't add up a column of numbers if her life depended on it? I can manage inventory. Dorothea looked at her again. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth, not even respect, but a kind of grudging calculation. A woman who looked like Abigail, who'd arrived with a bag that wasn't even full, wasn't going to be making demands. Wasn't going to be causing social complications. Wasn't going to be catching anyone's eye. There's a kitchen, Dorothea said, out by the old supply barn. It was used years ago before the main house kitchen was expanded. It's not been occupied for some time. She said some time, the way people say none of your business. We'll put you there for now. You'll take your meals separately. Abigail looked at the main house. She looked at the outbuildings below it. She looked at Dorothea's perfectly composed face. Where's the kitchen? She said. Dorothea pointed. It was the stone building at the bottom of the slope, half hidden behind the supply barn, with a roof that had clearly lost a fight with several previous winters, and a door hanging slightly off its top hinge. Even at a distance, even in the fading afternoon light, it looked like something that had been given up on. I'll need a lamp, Abigail said. You'll find one inside. I'll need supplies for the morning. There's a store cupboard in the main house kitchen. You may take what you need. Dorothea paused. Modest amounts. We'll establish a budget once we've assessed your abilities. Abigail nodded. She picked up her canvas bag. She walked down the slope toward the broken stone building at the bottom of the yard. Behind her, she heard Dorothea say something to someone who'd come out of the main house. She couldn't hear the words, but she heard the tone, and then she heard laughter. She didn't stop walking. The inside of the kitchen was worse than the outside had prepared her for. There was a cast iron stove in the center that looked salvageable, but hadn't been used in long enough that a family of mice had established what appeared to be multi-generational housing inside it. The shelves along the walls were thick with dust and held nothing but a few broken crocks, an empty tin with a rusted lid, and something she chose not to examine closely in the far corner. The floor was stone, which was actually good stone she could clean. The windows were intact, which was better than she'd expected. There was a lamp on the workbench, and it even had oil in it. She found the flint after 10 minutes of searching. She lit the lamp. She looked at the room in the lamplight for a long moment, taking stock. The stove, the shelves, the stone walls. The heavy wooden door she could fix if someone gave her the right size hinge pin. The storage room off the back she hadn't gone into yet, but could already calculate the square footage of. She set her canvas bag on the cleanest section of workbench she could find. She went and got the supplies from the main house kitchen. She took flour salt lard, a tin of baking powder, dried beans, and half a side of salt pork that looked like it had been pushed to the back of the shelf to be forgotten. The woman who was cooking in the main kitchen, a girl of about 19 with red hands and an anxious expression, watched her without saying anything. At the door, Abigail stopped. "What's your name?" The girl blinked. "Pearl." "Pearl, how long have you been cooking for this household?" "3 months, ma'am." "Who taught you?" "My mother, mostly, and some from a book." Abigail nodded. "You've got good instincts. The bread on that counter is proofed exactly right." She looked at the loaf. "You might try a slightly higher temperature on the first 10 minutes. Gets you a better crust." Pearl stared at her like she'd said something in a foreign language. Abigail walked back down the slope to the broken kitchen in the dark. She cleaned until midnight. She didn't have a mop, so she used rags. She didn't have proper cleaning solution, so she used water and a half tin of salt she found in the back of the storage room, and the knowledge that salt and friction accomplish most of what fancy solutions claim to. The mice were evicted from the stove with a combination of noise and the kind of calm, implacable persistence that tends to unnerve creatures who rely on panic for their defense. She found the flue blocked with 3 seasons of debris and spent an unpleasant hour clearing it with a length of wire she pulled from the fencing material stacked against the outside wall. By the time she lit the stove for the first time, it was past midnight. The temperature inside the building had dropped to something that made her breath show, and she hadn't eaten since the noon meal she'd packed herself for the wagon ride. She made biscuits, not because she was particularly hungry, though she was, but because the act of making something, of taking raw materials and converting them into something useful and warm, was the only reliable thing she knew how to do when everything else was uncertain. Her hands knew it. Her hands needed it. She sat on an overturned crate and ate biscuits by lamplight in the cleaned stone kitchen and listened to the Wyoming windwork on the outside walls and thought about what she was going to do with the storage room. She thought about it for a long time. She was still thinking about it when she fell asleep on the crate with her back against the wall and didn't wake up until the sky outside the high window had gone gray with early morning. She had work to do. The first week was about survival. She learned the rhythms of the ranch when the hands came in for meals. What hours? The main house was quiet, who came and went from the supply barn and on what schedule. She made note of what was wasted and what was missing. She watched Dorothea Crane conduct the household with the crisp efficiency of a woman who had decided that managing a rich man's domestic affairs was a form of power, and she watched the way Dorothea looked through her when their paths crossed the careful social geometry of making someone invisible. She also met Gerald Crane. Dorothea's brother was a thicker, louder version of his sister, with the same calculating eyes behind a more jovial exterior. He managed the ranch accounts, or was supposed to. He had the office in the main house, the ledgers, the authority that Cole Blackstone had apparently delegated out entirely since his wife's death. Gerald moved through the ranch with the comfortable confidence of a man who has correctly identified that the person who should be watching him isn't. The first time he noticed Abigail, he was coming out of the supply barn while she was inventorying what was stored there. He stopped in the doorway. "What are you doing in here?" "Counting," she said. "You don't have authorization to be in here." "Mr. Crane, I'm responsible for the kitchen provisions. The kitchen provisions come from this barn. I need to know what's here so I can plan." She didn't look up from the ledger she'd found and appropriated for her own records. "Is there something in here you don't want counted?" The silence lasted 2 beats longer than it should have. "I'll have Dorothea clarify your duties," he said and left. She wrote down exactly what she'd counted before she moved on. The second week was about the garden, or rather about what was left of it, the old kitchen garden behind the stone building that had clearly been well planned at some point and had been left to go to seed and ruin for years. She started clearing it in the early mornings before anyone else was moving. The soil was good, she could tell that much. Someone had known what they were doing when they put it in. But the growing season was over. Winter was coming in fast now, and there was no planting to be done. What she could do was harvest what had self-seeded and survived wild herbs, gone half feral. Late root vegetables that hadn't been taken, a patch of something she had to get on her knees to identify before she recognized it as a heritage variety of winter squash her grandmother had grown. She brought the squash in. She hung the herbs to dry from the kitchen rafters. She made notes about what she'd plant in spring, assuming she was still here in spring, assuming Dorothea didn't find some reason to send her packing before the first snow. She preserved everything she could get her hands on. She'd asked permission carefully, strategically, to have access to the surplus from the ranch's kitchen garden and the dairy and the smokehouse, framing it as waste reduction, as efficiency, as saving the ranch money on provisions they'd otherwise have to purchase. Gerald had been suspicious. Dorothea had been contemptuous. But she'd made the argument on purely practical grounds, and they couldn't dispute the practical grounds without revealing that they didn't want things accounted for. So they let her. She put up 43 jars in the first 2 weeks. Apple preserves from the wild trees along the creek that nobody had been harvesting. Pickled green tomatoes from the garden's last gasp. Dried corn she'd negotiated for from a farmer's wife in the nearest settlement, paying with a recipe that the woman had been trying to master for 3 years and couldn't. Smoked venison from the meat that had been mismanaged in the smokehouse and was heading toward waste. She labeled every jar. She logged every jar. She knew exactly what she had and exactly what it would provide. She was on her 44th jar when Dorothea came to find her. "People are talking about you," Dorothea said, standing in the doorway of the kitchen. Her eyes moved over the hanging herbs, the labeled jars on the newly repaired shelves, the cleaned and organized space that had been a ruin a month ago. Something complicated moved across her face and was controlled. Abigail kept working. "What are they saying?" "That you've been going through the supply barn. That you've been making inquiries about the ranch accounts. I've been managing provisions. That requires knowing what supplies we have." "Gerald feels you're overstepping." "Gerald is the ranch accountant," Abigail said pleasantly. "I'm the kitchen manager. Those are different functions. I'm happy to coordinate with him on anything that overlaps." "He doesn't want to coordinate with you. He wants you to stay in this kitchen and do what you're told." Abigail set down the jar she was filling. She turned to face Dorothea fully. She kept her voice level because she'd learned long ago that the only thing more dangerous than a woman who raises her voice is a woman who doesn't need to. "Mrs. Crane," she said, "I was given this kitchen. I've put it in order. I've reduced waste, improved provisions, and started building a supply reserve that this ranch is going to need before the winter is out. I've done that without complaint and without asking for anything I wasn't due. If Mr. Crane feels that my doing my job well is somehow a threat to him, that's a conversation worth having. But it's not a conversation that starts with me doing my job worse." Dorothea studied her for a long moment. "You're a bold one," she said finally. There was no warmth in it, but there wasn't quite contempt either. "I'm a practical one," Abigail said. "There's a difference." Dorothea left. Abigail picked up the jar and kept working. The third week brought the first real cold. The kind of cold that announces itself 3 days before it arrives, the way the light changes, and the cattle get restless, and the horses want to be in the barn before the men think it's necessary. Abigail had been watching it come. She'd increased her preservation work, pushed harder on the inventory, spent 2 evenings repairing the stone kitchen's insulation with a mixture of clay and hay she'd found in the old records as a traditional frontier technique and tested with her hand against the wall. The kitchen was warm. That was what she'd aimed for first. Warm and organized and functional and hers. That was when she started cooking for the hands. It hadn't been her assignment. Her assignment, strictly speaking, was kitchen provisions, managing supply, not feeding people directly. But she'd walked past the bunkhouse at supper time one evening and heard the sounds from inside, and they weren't the sounds of men eating well. They were the sounds of men eating because they had to, making the best of something that wasn't worth the effort. She'd thought about it for a day. Then she'd put a pot of venison stew on the stove, a big pot, the biggest she had, using the properly managed smoked venison and dried vegetables and herbs from the garden and a bone broth she'd been building for a week. And she'd sent Pearl, who'd taken to stopping by the stone kitchen in the late afternoons, learning things she wouldn't admit she was trying to learn, to let the bunkhouse know there was food. 23 men showed up. They came in their work clothes with their hats in their hands and ate standing at the workbenches because there weren't enough chairs, and they were quiet while they ate, in the way that men who have eaten too many bad meals are quiet when they finally get a good one. A big man named Hector, who turned out to be the foreman's second, ate 2 bowls and then stood in the doorway on his way out and said, "Ma'am, I don't know what you put in that, but this is the best thing I've eaten since I left my mother's house in Texas." "That's kind of you to say," Abigail told him. "Ain't kindness, ma'am, it's just the truth." He put his hat back on and walked out into the cold. The next evening there were 23 men again, plus the foreman, plus 2 men she hadn't seen before who turned out to be seasonal riders who'd heard about the stew from the bunkhouse and come in from their camp to investigate. She made cornbread to go with it. She made it with the recipe her mother had used, with a little extra fat and a touch of something sweet that made it pull apart different than most cornbread did. And the men ate it in silence, the way people eat things that remind them of something important. It was the 4th evening she was making a winter soup with preserved vegetables and the last of the fresh onions from the garden, when she heard the door open and assumed it was early hands coming in and didn't look up from the pot. "Miss Turner." The voice was different. Not the voice of a man who worked with his hands for other men. The voice of a man who'd once given orders and had recently stopped caring whether anyone followed them. She looked up. Cole Blackstone was standing in the doorway of her kitchen. She'd seen him at a distance twice since she'd arrived. Once crossing the yard on horseback, not looking at anything in particular. Once standing at the window of the main house in the late evening, a glass in his hand, watching the dark. She'd formed impressions, tall, broad, through the shoulders, carrying something heavy in the way he held himself. Not the weight of work, but the weight of something he'd decided he deserved to carry. Up close, he was younger than she'd thought. Not yet 40, though grief had done its aging work on him. Dark hair gone a little gray at the temples, brown eyes that looked like they'd forgotten how to be curious about anything. He was looking at her kitchen. She let him look. She kept stirring the pot. "Gerald tells me you've been interfering in ranch operations," he said. "Gerald tells you a lot of things, it sounds like." A pause. "That's a candid answer. You asked me a candid question. I asked you a statement." Then it was a candid response to a candid statement. She picked up the ladle and checked the consistency of the soup. "Have you eaten today, Mr. Blackstone?" Another pause. Longer. "Not recently." "Sit down then." "Miss Turner, the workbench is clean, there are crates that serve as passable stools, and the soup will be ready in about 10 minutes. You can stand and interrogate me, or you can sit and eat. Both options are available to you." He stood in the doorway for 3 more seconds. Then he came in and sat on a crate. She served him soup and cornbread when the hands came in, and he ate at the workbench among his own ranch workers without ceremony. And she watched, without appearing to watch the way the men reacted when they realized he was there. Not fear, something more complex than fear. The particular discomfort of people who have decided their leader has abandoned them and haven't yet updated that assessment. He cleaned his bowl. He didn't ask for more, but she refilled it anyway. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he said. "My mother, and necessity. And the knowledge that feeding people well is one of the few things you can do that they never forget." "The hands are talking about you." "I know. They say you've put this place in better order in 3 weeks than it's been in the past year." "That's probably generous. It's probably accurate." He looked at the shelves of labeled jars, the hanging herbs, the organized workbenches, the repaired shelves, the clean floor, the life in a building that had been dead. This kitchen was abandoned for 15 years. Dorothea wanted it torn down last spring, said it was an eyesore. It needed cleaning, not demolishing. "Most things do," he said quietly, and she couldn't tell whether he was talking about the kitchen anymore. He left without ceremony the way he'd come. She heard him stop in the yard and say something to one of the hands, actually stop and say something. Not the absent nod she'd been told was his standard engagement since the fever took his wife, and she heard the hand respond with something that sounded surprised in a good way. She watched the pot. She thought about a man who'd handed his ranch to people who were taking it apart and hadn't noticed or hadn't cared or had cared and couldn't make himself care enough to stop it. She thought about what that kind of grief did to a person. She knew something about it. Not the same flavor. She hadn't lost a husband, a partner, someone whose presence had shaped the shape of every day. But she knew the specific weight of waking up in a world that had rearranged itself while you weren't looking and having to decide whether you were going to rearrange yourself to match it. She'd decided yes. She wondered if Cole Blackstone had decided anything yet. The next morning, she was in the supply barn by 6, counting sacks of flour, when she found the first gap in the inventory that didn't match the records. She went back through the numbers twice. She pulled the ledger records, Gerald's ledger, the official one, and compared them to her own counts, which she'd been keeping in a separate book from the beginning, out of habit and caution, and the basic understanding that when someone doesn't want things counted, you count twice as carefully. 40 pounds of flour recorded as delivered, not present. 2 sides of salt pork recorded as in storage, not present. A barrel of molasses listed in inventory, absent. She wrote it all down in her own book. She wrote it carefully and completely. She noted the page numbers in Gerald's ledger where each item appeared. She noted the dates of the supposed deliveries. She noted the names of the suppliers listed, which she'd had occasion to meet some of, because she'd been buying from the same suppliers for her own kitchen needs and had learned their faces and their habits. She closed both books. She thought for a long time about what this meant and what to do about it. Then she went back to the kitchen and started making breakfast for 25 people, because whatever else was happening, those people needed to eat. Hector found her mid-morning while she was rendering fat from a batch of pork scraps that she'd been given permission to use. "Ma'am," he said without preamble, "you ought to know that Gerald Crane was at the supply barn this morning after you left." She kept working. "Was he?" "He was. And he didn't look pleased." "Does he often go to the supply barn in the morning?" Hector considered this. "Not so's I've noticed, ma'am. He's more a late morning at his desk kind of man." "Good to know," she said. "You finding things in there that somebody doesn't want found?" She looked at him. Hector was a big, quiet man with 20 years in Wyoming on his face, and the particular stillness of someone who has seen a lot and learned to wait before reacting. "I'm doing inventory," she said. "Yes, ma'am." A pause. "If you were to find things, and if those things were to be the kind of things that somebody might want to make disappear before anyone could act on them, theoretically, she said, it might be worth making sure your records were in a place that wasn't just wherever you keep them." She met his eyes. "I appreciate that counsel." He nodded and walked away. That evening she made a copy of every number she'd recorded. She put the copy in 3 different places: her canvas bag, a jar in the back of the storage room behind 42 other jars, and a letter she wrote to a woman she'd known from Cheyenne and asked Pearl to post the next time Pearl went into town, which Pearl did every other week for the household mail and which didn't require Gerald or Dorothea's approval. Pearl posted it without asking why. Pearl was learning things she wouldn't admit she was learning. 2 days later, Cole Blackstone came back to the kitchen at supper time. Not for food this time, or not only for food. He sat on the crate and he asked her questions. Not about the kitchen, about the ranch. "Dorothea tells me you've been asking about supplier contracts," he said. "I've been trying to understand where the provisions come from so I can plan the winter supply properly. She said you've been duplicating Gerald's ledger records." "I keep my own records. Kitchen managers typically do." He looked at her for a long time. "What are you not telling me, Miss Turner?" She put down what she was doing. She turned to face him. She thought about Hector's advice and the letter she'd sent, and the numbers written in her careful hand in 3 different locations. "Mr. Blackstone," she said, "I think there are some things happening on this ranch that you should look into directly, not through your cousin's reports, not through Gerald's accounts, directly." The look on his face was hard to read. Not surprise, more like a man who has been standing outside a burning building pretending not to smell smoke because going in would cost too much. "That's a serious thing to say." "Yes, sir." "If you're wrong, you'll be asked to leave." "I know that." "If you're right." He stopped, started again. "If you're right, it's going to make things very difficult for a lot of people." "Mr. Blackstone," she said quietly, "things are already difficult for a lot of people. They're just being difficult in a direction you haven't been looking." He was quiet for a long time. The hands had finished eating. The kitchen had gone down to just the 2 of them, and the sound of the stove and the wind working on the walls outside. "I'll look into it," he said finally. He stood, reached for his hat, then stopped with his hand on it and said without turning around, "The soup was good." "Thank you, sir." "Last week's bread was better." "I'll keep that in mind." He put his hat on and walked out into the Wyoming dark, and Abigail stood in her warm, clean, orderly kitchen, smelling of herbs and wood smoke and rendered fat, and thought about a man who was maybe finally starting to smell the smoke. She filled another jar. She labeled it. She set it on the shelf with the others. Outside, the first real snow of winter was starting to fall soft and steady, the kind of snow that doesn't stop. The kind that piles up while you're not watching and changes the whole shape of things by morning. She had a lot of jars to fill before spring. She had a lot of work to do. She got back to it. The snow that started falling the night Cole Blackstone walked out of her kitchen didn't stop for 3 days. Abigail knew it wouldn't. She'd felt it in the air a week before it came, that particular heaviness, the way the cattle bunched tighter than usual along the fence lines, the way the horses moved with an urgency that had nothing to do with anything the men were asking them to do. Animals knew. Her father had taught her that. Pay attention to what the animals know, and you'll rarely be caught unprepared. She had not been caught unprepared. By the time the first real accumulation was sitting 6 inches deep across the yard, she had enough preserved food in the stone kitchen storage room to feed 25 men for 6 weeks without resupply. She had dried meat, jarred vegetables, preserved fruit, hard cheese wrapped in wax and stacked on the cold shelves, smoked fish she'd traded for with a settlement family. 20 miles west. Cornmeal in sealed barrels, beans in quantities that would have seemed excessive to anyone who hadn't spent time calculating how many meals 25 working men required in temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there. She'd calculated it exactly. On the morning of the 3rd day of snow, Hector came to the kitchen before breakfast and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and a look on his face she hadn't seen from him before. "Ma'am," he said, "we got a problem." "Tell me." The main house kitchen just discovered their flour stores are about 1/3 of what they should be for winter. Pearl went to inventory this morning and, well... He stopped. "There's some panic." Abigail dried her hands on her apron. "What else?" "The smokehouse is short. Not a little short. Gerald's records show twice what's actually hanging in there. How many people in the main house? Household staff, family guests, 12 people regular." "They'll eat with the hands," Abigail said. Hector blinked. "Ma'am?" "Bring them down here, all 12. We've got room and we've got food." She turned back to the stove. "Tell Pearl to come help me." He stood there another moment. "Dorothea Crane isn't going to like that." "No." Abigail agreed pleasantly. "She is not." Pearl arrived in 10 minutes, flushed and wide-eyed, with the look of someone who'd been standing in the middle of a storm she hadn't predicted. "Mrs. Crane she's very upset, ma'am. She says this is unacceptable. She says the household does not eat with the ranch hands." "What does Mr. Blackstone say?" Pearl hesitated. He's the one who sent me." Abigail nodded. She handed Pearl an apron. "Then let's get the bread going. We'll need 4 batches." Dorothea Crane swept into the kitchen 40 minutes later, like a woman who has decided that the best response to a crisis is to generate a larger crisis herself. She was dressed immaculately despite the snow and the chaos which Abigail gave her credit for. Whatever her faults, Dorothea had discipline. "This is completely inappropriate," Dorothea announced. "The household does not take meals in the servant kitchen." "Mrs. Crane." Abigail kept her voice level. "The main house kitchen is short on supplies. My kitchen is not. People need to eat. Those are the 3 relevant facts." "The relevant fact is that you have no authority to..." "Dorothea." Cole Blackstone's voice came from the doorway. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. It was a voice that had remembered briefly that it belonged to a man who ran things. "Enough." Dorothea turned. Something moved across her face, and Abigail filed that something away because it wasn't just annoyance, it wasn't just wounded pride. It was the specific look of a person who has been managing someone and has just realized the person is no longer manageable. "The arrangements Miss Turner has made are sensible," Cole said. "We'll take meals here until the supply situation is sorted." "Cole, this woman does not have the standing to..." "She has food," he said simply. "We don't. That settles the question of standing." He came in and sat on a crate. Dorothea stood in the doorway for 3 long seconds, and then she left, and the quality of the air in the kitchen changed the way air changes when something that was pressing against you steps back. Pearl exhaled so loudly it was almost a word. "Keep kneading," Abigail told her. The first communal meal in the stone kitchen was a strange and electric thing. 25 ranch hands and 12 household staff and Cole Blackstone sat in the same space and ate the same food venison stew with preserved root vegetables and fresh bread and a dried apple crumble she'd put together from the stores. And the silence at the beginning was the silence of people who were all aware that something was different and weren't yet sure what it meant. Hector broke it. He said in his deliberate Texas way, "Reckon this might be the best meal this ranch has seen since before Mrs. Blackstone passed." And then he seemed to realize what he'd said and looked briefly horrified. But Cole, who was sitting 3 crates down from him, just looked at his bowl and said quietly, "You might be right about that, Hector." And the tension in the room dissolved into something more honest. A hand named Dix, who was about 60 and had been with the ranch since before Cole's time, looked at Abigail across the crowded kitchen and said, "Where'd you learn to make stew like this, ma'am?" "My mother," she said. "And 12 years of making do with whatever was available." "Well," Dix said, "whatever was available to you must have been considerably better than whatever's been available here, 'cause I haven't eaten like this in a long while." He looked around at the other hands. "Am I wrong?" He was not wrong. The room made that clear. Abigail went back to serving, but she felt something shift. Not dramatically, not loudly, but with the particular weight of things that are shifting for keeps. These people had been eating poorly for a year. Not starving, not suffering, just eating the way people eat when nobody is paying attention to them, when they're just mouths to fill rather than people worth feeding well. She'd changed that in 3 weeks almost, without anyone noticing, and now they were noticing all at once, and it was doing something to the atmosphere of the room that she couldn't quite name but recognized from her mother's kitchen on Sunday afternoons. It felt like belonging. The supply investigation started that same afternoon. She hadn't planned to push it that day. The snow was still coming. The meal had taken most of the morning. She had 40 other things to do. But Cole came to find her after the midday meal while she was restocking the shelves, and he had a look on his face that was different from every previous look she'd seen there. He'd been going through Gerald's ledgers himself. He'd spent the morning doing it alone in his office, while Dorothea presumably paced the main house, and Gerald presumably began to sweat. "You counted right," he said. "She kept stacking jars. I generally do. There's money missing, not just supplies, money from the account that covers supplier payments. I went back 6 months and the numbers—" He stopped. "The numbers don't add up, not even close." "No," she said. "They don't. How long have you known?" "I suspected within the first week. I confirmed it in the second." "And you didn't tell me immediately because I had one copy of records that could disappear and no standing to make accusations, and a man who hadn't been paying attention to his own ranch in over a year." She turned to look at him. "I needed time to make the record safe, and I needed to know whether you were someone who could hear this." He took that without flinching. "Am I?" "You're here," she said. "You came and looked yourself instead of sending Gerald to explain it away. That tells me yes." He sat down on the crate he'd claimed as his. It was the one slightly to the right of the stove where the heat was best. She'd noticed he always chose it. "Gerald is my wife's cousin," he said. "Martha brought him on when we were first married. She trusted him." "I'm sorry," she said. "That makes it harder." "Doesn't change what it is." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. If I confront him with this, he'll go to Dorothea. Dorothea will—" He rubbed his face with both hands. "She's been managing this household for 2 years. She knows everything about how it runs. If she decides to work against me, she's already working against you, Mr. Blackstone. She and Gerald both. They've just been doing it quietly enough that you didn't notice." Abigail said it without heat, without accusation, just the flat truth of the thing, the way you'd tell someone their fence was down. "The question isn't whether they'll fight back. They will. The question is whether you're willing to fight." He looked at her for a long time across the warm kitchen. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "Nobody ever is," she said. "Now, what do you want to do?" What he wanted to do, it turned out, was be careful. Abigail respected that. A man who'd been sleepwalking for a year handed evidence of betrayal by a woman he'd known for 3 weeks, who chose caution over reaction. That was a man who was actually waking up, not just thrashing. He started auditing the accounts himself quietly in the early mornings before Gerald arrived at his office. He asked Abigail questions, specific, detailed questions about suppliers and delivery dates and quantities that showed he was reading her records carefully. She answered all of them. She gave him copies of everything she'd documented and watched him sit at her workbench and go through them, line by line, with the focused intensity of a man who had been good at this once and was remembering how. Gerald noticed something was different within 4 days. She saw it in the way he moved through the ranch, still jovial on the surface, still the same expansive, backslapping presence he'd always performed, but with a watchfulness underneath it. Now that hadn't been there before. He came to the supply barn twice in the same day, which he'd never done before. He spent an extra hour in his office with the door closed. He sent the young clerk who helped him with the books on a sudden errand to the nearest town, an errand that conveniently removed the clerk from the ranch for 3 days. Abigail noted all of this. She told Cole what she'd observed. Cole listened and added it to the picture he was building. On the 5th day after the snow stopped, Cole called Gerald into his office. She knew it was happening because Hector told her, and Hector knew because Hector made it his business to know things that happened on the ranch he'd worked on for 11 years and cared about, with the steady, uncomplicated loyalty of a man who doesn't need credit for caring. He went in looking comfortable. Hector reported leaning against the kitchen doorframe that evening while Abigail made supper. Came out looking like he'd swallowed something bad. Did they raise their voices? Not so's I heard. But that office isn't exactly thin-walled, and I wasn't exactly in the room. Was Dorothea with him when he came out? Waiting for him in the hall. They went off together quick. Abigail stirred the pot. Thank you, Hector. Ma'am. He paused. Things are going to get louder before they get quieter, aren't they? It wasn't quite a question. Most things worth settling do, she said. They got louder the next morning. Abigail was in the middle of the breakfast service when Dorothea appeared in the kitchen doorway, with Gerald behind her, and an expression on her face that was beyond anything she'd shown before. Gone was the composed dismissiveness, the careful social management. What was in its place was something sharper and more desperate. Everyone out, Dorothea said to the room full of eating ranch hands. Nobody moved. Hector, who was sitting nearest the door, looked up from his bowl. Mornin', Mrs. Crane. I said out. This is not a matter for ranch hands. This is where we eat breakfast, ma'am, Dick said with the complete serenity of a man who has decided not to be moved. Dorothea looked at Abigail. You have been going through private ranch records. You have been interfering in financial matters that are entirely outside your authority. You have been filling Mr. Blackstone's head with fabrications and innuendo about a man who has served this ranch faithfully for— Dorothea, Cole Blackstone's voice from the doorway. He'd followed them down apparently. He came in and stood in the middle of the crowded kitchen and the room got very quiet. We talked about this. Cole, she is a servant who came here 3 weeks ago with nothing, and she has spent that time insinuating herself into— She's been doing her job, Cole said. And while she was doing her job, she found things. And I've now looked at those things myself, with my own eyes, with my own accounting. He looked at Gerald. The numbers don't lie, Gerald. Gerald's joviality had entirely vacated his face. What was underneath it was something older and harder, and much less comfortable to look at. Cole, whatever this woman has told you, she didn't tell me much, Cole said. She told me to look for myself. I looked. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. Abigail recognized it as one of the summary sheets she'd prepared for him. 6 months, 11 suppliers. Payments recorded for deliveries that never arrived. I've already sent a writer to confirm with 3 of those suppliers directly, and 2 have confirmed they haven't had a contract with this ranch since spring. The kitchen was absolutely silent. Gerald looked at the paper. He looked at Cole. He looked at Abigail. And in that moment, the calculation she could see happening in his eyes was not whether to confess, but what angle of attack was still available to him. He chose blame. She set this up, he said. She came here with false records. She's been manipulating the inventory to— Gerald. Cole's voice was quiet and final. Don't. Cole, listen to me. This woman is— look at her. Look at who you're choosing to believe here. She came in from nowhere. Nobody vouched for her. Nobody knows who she— I know who she is. Cole said. She's the woman who's been feeding 25 men 3 honest meals a day for 3 weeks and keeping better records of this ranch's provisions than you've kept of its finances in 6 months. He put the paper back in his pocket. I want you and Dorothea out of the main house by tomorrow morning. I'll have the final accounting prepared, and you can respond to it then. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Abigail had ever been in. Dorothea turned to look at her. Not with anger exactly, something that had moved past anger into a kind of cold, focused thing. You'll regret this, Dorothea said, to Abigail, not to Cole. That may be, Abigail said, but not today. Dorothea and Gerald left. The kitchen exhaled. Dix picked up his biscuit and took a bite. Well, he said to no one in particular, that was something. A few men laughed. Uncertain, surprised laughter, the kind that comes out when tension breaks before you're ready for it. Hector was watching Abigail with an expression she couldn't quite read. Pearl was standing near the stove, with a bread peel in her hands and her eyes about twice their normal size. Cole was looking at Abigail. You're not surprised, he said. No, she said. Did you know it would go like that? I knew something like it would. When people have something to lose, they try to take it out on whoever they think is weakest. They thought that was you. Most people do it first. She turned back to the stove. Eggs. What? You haven't eaten. Do you want eggs? He stared at her for a moment. Then something happened in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Something that was almost the beginning of a smile, though it didn't quite make it all the way. Yes, he said. Thank you. She made him eggs and he ate them standing at the workbench, and the hands finished their breakfast around him, and the kitchen settled back into its rhythms, and outside the snow had stopped, and the sky had gone the particular sharp blue of a Wyoming winter morning. The peace lasted 4 days. She should have expected that. She did expect it in a general way. She'd known Gerald and Dorothea wouldn't simply accept what had happened and depart quietly. People who've been running a game for 6 months don't fold their cards because someone noticed the deck was marked. They rearrange. They go to people who haven't been turned against them yet. What she hadn't fully anticipated was Silas Mercer. She'd heard the name in the way you hear names on a ranch when you're paying attention to things people don't realize you're paying attention to. Silas Mercer was a cattle baron operating out of the southern part of the territory. He had interests in multiple ranches and supply contracts in the kind of land deals that happened when ranches failed and their property went to auction at prices below value. He'd been to Blackstone Ranch twice in the past year, social visits ostensibly the kind that men who consider themselves powerful use to maintain the impression that other people's property is within their sphere. Cole didn't like him. Abigail had gathered that from the way Cole's posture changed when the name came up, the subtle set of his jaw. What she gathered now, watching Gerald's hired hand ride out toward the south on the day after Gerald and Dorothea vacated the main house, was that Silas Mercer was about to become more than a name. She told Cole that evening. Mercer, he said. The word landed in the kitchen like something heavy. He and Gerald have been in contact. I don't know the specifics, but the direction that rider went. Mercer's been wanting this ranch for 2 years, Cole said. He made an offer the year before Martha died. I turned it down. What happened to the offer after she died? Cole looked at her. He renewed it. I didn't respond. Gerald would have known that offer existed. Gerald managed all my correspondence for the past year. He said it flatly, the way you'd say the thing you most didn't want to say. Everything that came through this ranch went through Gerald. They looked at each other. How bad is it? She said. Could be very bad, he said. If Mercer has been using Gerald to create the conditions for the ranch to fail to document financial difficulties, to set up grounds for a forced sale. He stopped. I don't know how much of my correspondence he redirected. I don't know what commitments might have been made in my name. We need to know. Yes. Then we start there, Abigail said. Tomorrow. We go through everything Gerald had access to. Every letter, every contract, every account. She paused. Do you trust Hector? Completely. Then it's the 3 of us. Nobody else until we know what we're dealing with. She stood up. Eat something. I made a pie. Miss Turner. You think better when you've eaten, she said. I've been watching you for 3 weeks. You'll argue with that, but you know it's true. He didn't argue with it. She cut him a piece of dried apple pie, and he ate it at the workbench. And she watched him think. Watched the calculation happen behind his eyes, the reassembling of a mind that had gone dormant and was coming back online, piece by piece. It was something to watch. She'd known he was capable. You didn't build a ranch the size of Blackstone by accident, didn't earn the reputation that preceded him by luck. The grief had buried it. But buried things in her experience were not gone. They just needed someone to dig. She wasn't sure when she'd started thinking of herself as someone who might do that digging. She wasn't sure it was wise. She was a woman without property, without family, without standing in this territory. A woman who'd arrived with a canvas bag and a set of skills and the kind of stubbornness that sometimes looked like courage and sometimes looked like foolishness, depending on how things turned out. The sensible thing was to keep her head down, do her work, avoid the war that was clearly coming. But she'd never been particularly sensible in that direction. She'd been sensible about food and accounts and the right temperature for bread, and the exact ratio of salt to brine for preservation. She'd been sensible about sleep and work and the management of limited resources. She had not at any point in her life been sensible about walking away from something that needed doing just because it was dangerous. Her mother had been the same way. She thought about that, about her mother in the kitchen that was gone now, doing exactly what Abigail was doing in this kitchen that had been given as an insult. Working, building, refusing. She refilled Cole's coffee without being asked and went back to the evening's preservation work, and outside the Wyoming dark, pressed against the stone walls, and somewhere to the south, a rider was carrying a message to a man who wanted this ranch, and there was a lot of work left to do. The thing about a fight you can see coming is that it gives you time to prepare. Abigail prepared. She went through Gerald's files with Cole and Hector, over 3 days building a picture that was worse than Cole had hoped and better than he'd feared. Gerald had redirected some correspondence to letters from Mercer's lawyers that had proposed terms Cole had never seen one, of which Gerald had apparently drafted a non-committal response to in Cole's name. He'd been inflating supply costs and keeping the difference. He'd created 3 fictional supplier relationships through which ranch money had been flowing outward. But he hadn't been quite clever enough to clean his tracks completely, and with Abigail's supply records as a counterpoint to his financial records, the deception was provable. It was provable, but it needed to stay provable. Mercer will come, Cole said on the 3rd evening. Whatever Gerald told him, whatever he's been planning, he'll come to see for himself. When he realizes Gerald is gone, he'll want to assess the situation directly. When he comes, Abigail said, we need to be ready. He'll make another offer for the ranch, maybe in the guise of helping, maybe framing the financial difficulties as worse than they are. Let him think they are worse than they are, Abigail said. Cole looked at her. What? Let him come. Let him see what he expects to see: a ranch in trouble, a man who's been betrayed, a situation that looks vulnerable. She paused. And then show him what's actually here. You want to set a trap. I want to let him walk into the truth, she said. Those are different things. The truth is already here. He just doesn't know what it is yet. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You know what you're doing, don't you? Not just the food, all of it. I know what I'm doing, she agreed. Why? He said, not rudely, genuinely. Why are you doing this? You've been here 3 weeks. You could have done your work and kept your head down and stayed out of this entire mess. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, Because this ranch is worth saving. Because the people here are worth taking care of. And because I was given a broken-down kitchen that everyone had given up on, and I didn't give up on it, and I'm not built to give up on things just because somebody else already did. She picked up a jar. She set it on the shelf. Now, she said, tell me everything you know about Silas Mercer. Cole told her. She listened and planned, and the kitchen stayed warm, and winter settled in hard across the Wyoming territory. And the fight that was coming moved closer with every cold, clear day. She was ready. She had always been ready. That was what everyone kept underestimating about her. Silas Mercer arrived on a Tuesday. He didn't announce himself. That was the first thing Abigail noticed: a man with that kind of money and that kind of ambition, who could have sent a rider ahead, who could have given Cole 2 days' warning, the way a man with honest intentions would. He didn't. He rode in with 4 men behind him on a clear, cold morning when the yard was full of hands doing their regular work, and he did it the way men do when they want to see a thing before the thing has time to arrange itself for company. Abigail was at the supply barn when they rode in. She saw him from across the yard. Silas Mercer was about 50, with the kind of build that used to be powerful and had softened into something that still wanted to be read as powerful. He wore good clothes, not flashy, but expensive, in the way that doesn't need to announce itself. He had a wide, easy smile that he put on before he dismounted, the way you'd put on a coat, and he was already talking to the nearest ranch hand before his boots hit the ground. She watched him scan the yard. She watched him take in the organized state of the outbuildings, the well-fed cattle in the near pasture, the smoke coming from the stone kitchen's chimney. She watched him recalibrate something in his expression just slightly, just for a half-second before the easy smile came back. He'd expected to find things in worse shape. She turned and walked to the kitchen and sent Pearl at a run to find Cole. Cole was in his office when Pearl found him, which meant he'd been working since before sunup, the way he'd been doing every day for 2 weeks now, rebuilding his understanding of his own ranch from the ground up, going through every record Gerald had kept with the slow, methodical anger of a man who couldn't afford to be careless. He came out into the yard with his hat on and his face composed, and Abigail watched from the kitchen doorway as he crossed the yard to where Mercer was waiting. She couldn't hear what they said. She didn't need to. She could read the geometry of it. Mercer's expansive posture, the handshake that lasted a beat too long, the way he gestured toward the main house as though he'd already decided they'd be going inside. Cole's posture was different from what it had been a month ago. Straighter, more present. He nodded once and led Mercer toward the house, and Mercer's 4 men stayed in the yard, and one of them, a lean, watchful man who hadn't smiled since they rode in, looked directly at the stone kitchen, looked directly at Abigail in the kitchen doorway. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went inside and started making coffee. Hector appeared 20 minutes later. "He's in the main house," he said. "Been talking to Cole for about 15 minutes. He brought a lawyer. Man with a leather case, looks like he's never been on a horse before in his life." "A lawyer," Abigail said. "A lawyer," Hector confirmed. She poured him coffee and thought about that. A man who rides in unannounced doesn't bring a lawyer unless he's planning to present documents. Documents you bring ready mean you've drafted them already. Documents drafted already mean you've been expecting this moment. "Is the copy of the supply records still where we put it?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. And the second copy, with Pearl's letter already posted." She'd sent a second letter 3 days ago, not to her Cheyenne friend this time, but to a land attorney in Laramie, whose name Cole had given her, a man who'd been a friend of Cole's father and who Cole trusted. She'd sent copies of everything. Every number, every discrepancy, every false supplier entry. She'd done it quietly, and she hadn't told Cole until after because she'd needed him to not stop her, and she'd known he might. He hadn't been angry. He'd been quiet for a long moment, and then said, "You were right too," and gone back to his ledgers. "What do you think Mercer's going to offer?" Hector asked. "Something that looks like help," she said. "A partnership arrangement. Maybe a loan against the property. Something structured so that if Cole can't meet a payment, the ranch transfers." She set down her cup. "It'll be written to look reasonable. It'll have a timeline that's designed to be just barely impossible." Hector was quiet for a moment. "You know an awful lot about how men like that operate for someone who was cooking for herself out of a canvas bag 6 weeks ago." "My father lost land to a man like that," she said. "I was 12. I watched my father read the contract 3 times and say it looked fair, and my mother read it once and say something was wrong, and the lawyer who drew it up was the one who'd told them it was fine." She looked at her coffee. "We were off that land inside a year. My mother was right about every word of it." Hector set down his cup. I'm sorry, ma'am. Don't be sorry, she said. Be useful. I need to know what Mercer says when he leaves that house, and I need to know it before Cole has time to sit with it alone. Cole came to the kitchen 2 hours later. He sat on his crate. He'd stopped even hesitating before sitting on it, had started thinking of it as his, which Abigail had noticed and filed alongside all the other things she noticed, and he put his hands flat on the workbench and stared at them. Tell me, she said. He wants to buy a 40% stake in the ranch, Cole said. Framed as a rescue operation. He says word has gotten out about Gerald's about the financial irregularities. He says there are suppliers threatening to withdraw credit. He says the ranch's reputation in the territory is compromised. Is any of that true? One supplier has raised concerns. One. He looked up. He made it sound like a landslide, like the whole territory has written us off. And the 40%. He'd provide capital immediately, stabilize the operations. His man would take over financial management. He paused. His man. Not Gerald. No. Someone new. Someone of his choosing. So Gerald delivered him the evidence of vulnerability, and now Mercer rides in with the solution, Abigail said. And the solution happens to give him control of the finances and 40% of the land. The contract his lawyer presented had a performance clause, Cole said. If profitability doesn't reach a specified level within 18 months, the stake converts to 60%. Abigail set down her ladle. Cole. I know. That's not a partnership. That's a purchase on installment. I know that, Abigail. It was the first time he'd used her given name. Neither of them acknowledged it. What did you tell him? She said. I told him I'd consider it. He said it with the particular flatness of a man who knows he said the wrong thing and is waiting for someone to confirm it. How long do you have? He's staying at the Laramie Hotel. He wants an answer by Friday. Today was Tuesday. She thought fast. 3 days. 3 days against a man with a lawyer and a prepared contract, and 6 months of Gerald's groundwork behind him, and a story about the ranch's reputation that, even if only partially true, would be hard to counter quickly. The supplier, she said. The one who raised concerns. Who is it? Dunmore. He runs the grain operation north of town. Has he actually withdrawn credit or just raised concerns? Raised concerns according to Mercer, which means Mercer might have gone to Dunmore himself, might have made the concerns worse than they are, or made them exist in the first place. She looked at Cole. I need to talk to Dunmore. Abigail. I've been trading with him for 6 weeks, she said. He knows my records. He knows what I've been building here. He knows the ranch's supply situation is better than it was. She was already moving, pulling off her apron. Can you get me to town this afternoon? Cole stared at her. You want to go talk to a grain supplier? I want to go talk to a man who might have been lied to about this ranch's condition, so that another man could use those lies to steal it. She looked at him steadily. Yes. He got her to town by 2 in the afternoon. He drove the wagon himself. Dunmore's grain operation was on the north edge of Laramie, a big practical man with a red beard and an accountant's memory for numbers, which was why Abigail had liked dealing with him from the first week. Men who remember numbers are men you can reason with. He looked surprised when she came in. And then he looked at Cole, who'd come in behind her, and his expression became more complicated. Mr. Blackstone, he said carefully. I wasn't expecting. Mr. Dunmore. Abigail said, I understand you've had some concerns about the ranch's credit situation. I'd like to show you something if you'll give me 10 minutes. She put her records on his counter. Her books, the ones she'd kept since week 1. The detailed labeled cross-referenced accounts of every supply transaction, every inventory count, every preserved jar and smoked side and barrel of grain. She walked him through 6 weeks of numbers in a clear, quiet voice, and Dunmore followed along with the concentration of a man who respects precision when he sees it. At the end of it, he was quiet for a moment. Where'd you get the money for the Hendricks order? He said, pointing to an entry from 2 weeks back. That was cash on delivery. Mr. Blackstone authorized it directly from operating funds, she said. I can show you the authorization if you need it. I heard the operating funds were frozen, tied up in the irregularity investigation. Who told you that? A pause. A man came in about 10 days ago. Said he was a business associate of the ranch. What did he look like? Dunmore described Gerald Crane down to the hat. Abigail looked at Cole. Cole's jaw was tight. Mr. Dunmore, Cole said, in a voice that was controlled enough that only someone paying close attention would have heard what was underneath it. Gerald Crane was dismissed from this ranch 2 weeks ago, pending a fraud investigation. He is no longer associated with Blackstone Ranch in any capacity. Dunmore looked between them. He had paperwork, looked official. Whatever he showed you. Abigail said, I'd ask you to compare it to what's in front of you right now. These records are complete. They're accurate. And this ranch has honored every commitment it's made to your operation. Another silence. Dunmore looked at the books. He looked at Cole. He looked at Abigail. Mrs. Crane also paid me a visit, he said quietly. About 3 weeks back. The words landed in the room like something thrown. What did she say? Abigail asked. Said the ranch was having management problems. Said there was a woman they'd brought on who was handling supplies improperly, that I should be cautious about extending credit. He paused. She was convincing. I imagine she was, Abigail said. She's had a lot of practice. Miss Turner, I'm sorry, I don't... Turner is fine. Miss Turner? What I said to Mercer's man last week, I may have confirmed some concerns that... He stopped, rubbed his beard. I may have given him more to work with than I intended. Then let's correct that, she said. What would it take? Dunmore thought about it. Then he said, a letter, from me, to the Territory Commercial Record confirming the ranch's account is in good standing. He paused. And I'd want to see 1 more month of those records before I extend full credit again. You'll have them, Cole said. And I'd want to apologize, I think, for being too quick to... He looked at Abigail. I should have come to you directly, instead of... You responded to the information you had, Abigail said. Now you have better information. That's what matters. They had the letter by 4 o'clock. On the ride back to the ranch, Cole was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that has a lot of thinking in it. Dorothea went to him 3 weeks ago, he said finally. Before you'd even looked at Gerald's books, she said. They'd been planning for this, not just Gerald and Mercer, Dorothea too. He was staring at the road ahead. She's been in this household for 2 years. She knows she knew everything. Every supplier relationship, every creditor, every weak point. She laid the groundwork, Abigail said. Gerald kept the books to support it, and Mercer was waiting to walk through the door they opened. How long? My best guess since early this year, maybe before. He didn't say anything for a while. Then, Martha introduced Dorothea to me. She vouched for her personally. He paused. Martha would have been horrified. Abigail didn't say anything to that. Some things you just let a person carry. After a moment, he said quietly, Thank you for going with me today. Thank you for driving, she said. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. It got a little further than last time. The next morning brought the first real test of everything Abigail had built. She was in the kitchen before sunrise when she heard voices in the yard. Not ranch hand voices, not the regular noise of morning work, but something sharper, more agitated. She went to the door and saw 2 of Mercer's men talking to Hector near the supply barn, and the conversation was not friendly. She stayed in the doorway and watched. Hector had his arms crossed and his face in the particular configuration it took on when he was being immovable. One of Mercer's men, the lean, watchful one who'd looked at her on the first day, was saying something with his hands moving which Hector was receiving without apparent effect. Then the lean man looked over at the kitchen, looked at Abigail. He walked across the yard toward her. Miss Turner, he said. He had a southern accent and a careful voice. I'm Ames. I work for Mr. Mercer. I know who you are, she said. Mr. Mercer would like a meeting. This morning, before things go any further. Mr. Mercer can speak with Mr. Blackstone. Mr. Mercer wants to speak with you. She looked at him. Why? Ames considered his words with the attention of someone who's been trained to consider them. Mr. Mercer has come to understand that the situation here is somewhat different from what he was led to believe. He'd like to understand it better. Who led him to believe it? I think you know the answer to that. She studied him. There was something in his manner that wasn't quite Mercer's instrument. Something that felt like a man doing a job he's ambivalent about, which was a different thing entirely. Does Mr. Blackstone know about this meeting request? She said. Not yet. Then there won't be a meeting, she said. Anything Mr. Mercer wants to say to me, he can say in front of Mr. Blackstone. Those are my terms. She looked at him steadily. You can tell him that. Ames looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression that wasn't quite admiration, but was in the neighborhood. Yes, ma'am, he said, and walked back across the yard. She told Cole within the hour. He listened. He didn't get angry. He'd moved past the kind of anger that needs immediate expression into something quieter and more purposeful. He wants to negotiate separately, Cole said. Cut you out of the room so whatever we agree on, you're not there to... He stopped. To notice the details, she said, or to object to them. He's recalibrating, she said. He knows Gerald's version of this ranch isn't the reality. He's trying to find out what the reality is before Friday. Should I meet with him? Yes, but not alone, and not here. She looked at him. Have him come to the kitchen, she said. Cole raised an eyebrow. Let him see exactly what's here, she said. Let him see the supplies, the records, the organization. Let him understand that the weakness Gerald sold him doesn't exist anymore. She paused. And let him see that you have someone managing provisions who knows what she's doing. You want to walk him through the kitchen. I want to do my work while the two of you talk, same as I do every day. She met his eyes. But yes, Silas Mercer came to the stone kitchen that afternoon, and he did not look entirely comfortable about it, which told Abigail everything she needed to know about how he'd expected this trip to go. He was a man accustomed to conducting business in offices and dining rooms, and whatever he'd imagined about the woman Gerald had probably described as an overweight servant who'd gotten above herself the stone kitchen with its organized shelves and its warm stove and its smell of bread and preserved fruit and wood smoke was not it. He sat where Cole indicated on the workbench stool, which was the only other seating, because Abigail's crate was occupied by a 40-pound sack of cornmeal she'd moved there that morning, specifically, and he opened his mouth to begin. And then Abigail set a cup of coffee in front of him without asking if he wanted it, and went back to the counter and kept working, and the rhythm of the kitchen continued undisturbed, and Mercer found himself in the particular social position of a man who's walked into someone else's territory and hasn't fully processed it yet. Cole was good. Abigail had been watching him for weeks, and she knew what he was capable of, but she hadn't quite seen it deployed yet in a direct confrontation. He was direct without being aggressive. He laid out the facts of the financial fraud without heat. He presented Dunmore's letter. He described the state of the ranch's actual supply situation, and he said calmly, "The conditions your proposal was designed to exploit don't exist." Mercer was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved to Abigail briefly, measuring, and then back to Cole. "Cole," he said, dropping the formality with the practiced ease of a man who uses informality as a tool. "I was given information that turned out to be inaccurate. I came here in good faith based on that information." "The information came from a man who was stealing from my ranch," Cole said. "A man who'd been coordinating with you. I deal with many people across this territory. If Gerald Crane misrepresented Mr. Mercer..." Abigail didn't turn from the counter. She kept working because stopping work to make a point in your own kitchen was a luxury she didn't need. "We have Gerald's correspondence, including 3 letters addressed to your office in the past 4 months." Silence. She heard it, the specific quality of a silence that is a man revising his position under pressure. She'd been listening for it. "Business correspondence," Mercer said carefully. "Normal." One of them discussed a timeline, she said, for when the ranch's credit position would be sufficiently compromised to make the current proposal viable. She set down what she was working on and turned to look at him, because sometimes you do stop work for a point, just not the ones they expect. Does that sound like normal business correspondence to you? Mercer looked at her for a long moment. He had intelligent eyes. She'd give him that. There was real intelligence there, the kind that quickly distinguishes between a fight you can win and a fight you can't. "What is it you want, Miss Turner?" he said. "I don't want anything," she said. "This isn't my ranch. Mr. Blackstone wants you to withdraw the current proposal. Acknowledge that the communications between your office and Gerald Crane constituted an improper attempt to manipulate the ranch's business position and agree to a clean settlement. In exchange, Mr. Blackstone isn't prepared at this time to pursue legal action." She paused. "Are those terms accurate, Mr. Blackstone?" Cole said. "Those are exactly the terms." Mercer looked between them. Whatever he'd been planning to do with this trip, this was not it. She could see him recalculating not just the immediate situation, but the larger picture, the legal exposure, the question of what exactly she'd said they had in writing. "I'd want my lawyer present," he said. "Of course," Cole said. "Tomorrow morning." "The kitchen will be open," Abigail said, and turned back to the counter. Mercer left with his coffee untouched. Ames, who'd been waiting outside, looked at Abigail through the open doorway as Mercer passed him. His expression was unreadable. Then, very slightly, he touched the brim of his hat. She nodded once and went back to work. That evening after supper, Hector sat in the kitchen for a long time after the other hands had left. He was quiet in the way Hector was quiet, not empty, but full of things he was deciding whether to say. "There's going to be talk," he finally said. "About tomorrow. About whatever Mercer agrees to. Gerald and Dorothea, they're still in town, still talking." "I know. Word's gotten to some of the settlement families that something's wrong at Blackstone. They're worried about the winter trades, about whether the agreements we made for provisions are still whether things are stable here." Abigail looked at him. "Which families?" "The Hendrickses, the Calloway widow, the Morrison family west of the creek." She knew all three. She'd traded with all three. She'd sat in the Calloway widow's kitchen and exchanged recipes and talked about what grew best in the rocky soil along the western property line. "I'll go see them," she said. "That's 3 separate rides, ma'am, in winter." "I know how many it is." She started putting on her coat. "Tell Pearl to handle the morning meal. I'll be back by midday. Tonight." Hector stood up. "No, tomorrow, before the meeting with Mercer." She looked at him. "I need those families to know the ranch is sound before the meeting, not after. If they come to the winter feast, Cole's been talking about a feast. He mentioned it once. If they come to it with fear already in them, everything looks different. If they come already trusting." She stopped. Hector finished for her. "The feast becomes proof instead of performance." "Yes," she said. He thought about it. "I'll ride with you. 2 of us cover 3 families faster than 1. "You don't have to." "Miss Turner," he said with a patience that had a little affection in it. "I've worked this ranch for 11 years. Those families are my neighbors, and also—" He picked up his hat. "Cole would never forgive me if I let you ride out alone and something happened." She looked at him. "Has he said that?" "He didn't need to," Hector said simply. She turned away before he could see whatever was on her face. The night Mercer's lawyer arrived the next morning was also the night the real attack started. Not from Mercer as it turned out, but from a direction Abigail hadn't fully accounted for. Dorothea Crane had been quiet since leaving the ranch. Too quiet. Abigail had known it and watched for it and still wasn't quite prepared for the specific form it took. The rider came in around noon while Mercer's lawyer was still in Cole's office. He was a young man she didn't recognize, and he went straight to the main house, and 10 minutes later, Cole appeared in the kitchen doorway, with a look on his face that was different from any she'd seen there. "What is it?" she said immediately. He held up a single sheet of paper. Someone has filed a formal complaint, he said, with the Territorial Commerce Office, alleging misappropriation of ranch funds. He paused. By you. The kitchen was very still. By me, she said. By you, by name, alleging that you've been diverting provisions purchased with ranch funds to personal trade, that the records you've been keeping are falsified. He looked at the paper, then at her. It was filed by Dorothea Crane. Abigail stood very still for a moment. She thought about the 3 copies of her records. She thought about the letter in Laramie. She thought about Dunmore's letter and Hector's loyalty, and Pearl standing near the stove, learning things she wouldn't admit she was learning. Then she thought about the 43 families in the valley who were counting on the winter trade agreements she'd spent 6 weeks building. She thought about the feast Cole had talked about, the gathering, the proof of what this ranch had become. She thought about everything she'd built in this kitchen that someone thought they could take from her with a piece of paper. She looked at Cole. "When's the feast?" she said. He blinked. "What? The winter feast. You mentioned it 3 weeks ago and never set a date." She moved to the shelf and picked up her inventory book. "Set a date. 2 weeks from now. Invite everyone, the settlement families, the ranchers, the traders, the Callaway widow, the Hendrickses, every person who has a stake in what happens in this valley." She looked at him steadily. Because the answer to a lie is not a denial. The answer to a lie is the truth in front of everyone, with nowhere to hide. Cole looked at the complaint in his hand. He looked at her. He looked at the shelves of preserved food, and the organized records, and the warm, functioning kitchen that had been a ruin 2 months ago. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, she said. And in the meantime, I need to know whether you believe what's in that paper. He looked at her. Didn't hesitate. Not for 1 second, he said. Then let's get back to work, she said. We have a feast to plan, and a lawyer to deal with, and a Mercer settlement to finalize. She opened the inventory book. And I need to start calculating how much food to prepare for 100 people. He stood in the doorway another moment. There was something in his face. She was getting better at reading a particular quality of looking at her that was becoming harder to categorize as simple respect or gratitude or professional regard. It was becoming something else. Something she wasn't ready to name yet, and wasn't sure he was ready to name either. He put his hat on. I'll set the date, he said. Good, she said. Now go deal with Mercer. I'll be here. He left. She opened the inventory book and started making lists, and the fire in the stove burned steady and warm. And outside, the Wyoming winter pressed in from every direction. And somewhere in Laramie, a woman who'd tried to ruin her was waiting to see if it had worked. It hadn't. It wouldn't. Abigail Turner had been given a broken kitchen and turned it into something that fed the whole valley. She was not going to let someone take that with a lie. She started making lists. She had a feast to build. The complaint Dorothea had filed didn't stay quiet. Abigail had known it wouldn't. A formal accusation filed with the Territorial Commerce Office wasn't a private letter. It was a stone dropped in still water, and the ripples moved fast in a territory where everyone knew everyone, and news traveled at the speed of the next rider through town. By the second day after the filing, she could feel it in the way people looked at her when she crossed the yard. Not the hands they'd made their positions clear and held them, but the seasonal workers, the men who'd been hired recently, and didn't have the foundation of 6 weeks of good meals and honest dealing to stand on. She caught 2 of them in a quiet conversation near the barn that stopped the moment she came around the corner. She noted it. She kept walking. Pearl was the one who told her what was being said in town. Pearl had been going to town every other week since before Abigail arrived, and she'd developed, in the way quiet, observant young women do, an almost uncanny ability to absorb what was being said in the general store and the post office and the street outside the hotel without appearing to be listening to any of it. They're saying you came here without a reference, Pearl told her on the 3rd morning while they were working side by side at the prep counter. That nobody in Cheyenne can account for you. That Gerald only hired you as a charity because you had nowhere to go, and he felt sorry for you, and you repaid that charity by going through private records and turning Mr. Blackstone against his own family. Abigail kept working. Who's saying it? Mostly people who've been talking to Mrs. Crane. She's been at the hotel in town 4 days running. She's very good at it, ma'am. At talking, at making things sound reasonable. I know she is. She told Mrs. Halverson that you've been running a private trade operation out of the kitchen, selling ranch provisions to settlement families and keeping the money. Pearl's voice was careful, not doubting, but careful with the weight of it. She has someone who says they saw money change hands. Money did change hands, Abigail said. Every transaction I've made on behalf of this kitchen involved money. It's all in the records. Yes, ma'am, but she's saying the records are fabricated. I know. She turned to look at Pearl directly. Do you believe that? Pearl met her eyes. She was 19 and had been learning things for 6 weeks and had the earnest, slightly fierce quality of someone who has recently decided what kind of person they want to be. No, ma'am, she said. I don't. Good, Abigail said. Then keep your ears open and tell me everything. The Mercer settlement had been signed on Thursday morning, 2 days after the complaint was filed, and it was cleaner than Abigail had dared hope. Mercer's lawyer had spent the better part of a day trying to reframe the letters between Mercer's office and Gerald as routine business correspondence, and Cole's attorney, the man in Laramie who'd known Cole's father, who'd arrived by the Thursday morning coach, with the quiet, unhurried confidence of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of work, had spent that same day demonstrating why that reframing didn't survive contact with the actual documents. Mercer had signed before noon. No partnership, no stake. A formal acknowledgement that his office had received information about Blackstone Ranch's condition from a party who has since been found to have provided fraudulent representations. A clean withdrawal of the proposal. And this was the piece Cole had insisted on, quietly and absolutely, a written statement that Blackstone Ranch's financial standing in the territory was not compromised by the events of the previous 6 months. Cole had come back to the kitchen with the signed documents and set them on the workbench and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "It's done." "Good," she said. "Mercer's leaving today, taking his men with him." He paused. "Ames asked me to give you something." He held out a folded note. She opened it. It said in a precise, economical hand, "Miss Turner, in 20 years working for Mr. Mercer, I have been present for a great many negotiations. I have never seen one concluded quite so efficiently. Should you find yourself in need of a character reference, I would be glad to provide one. R. Ames." She folded it back up and put it in her apron pocket. "What does it say?" Cole asked. "That I'm good at my job," she said. He almost smiled, getting better at that. But Dorothea's complaint was a different animal than Mercer's proposal, and Abigail knew it. A business proposal could be outmaneuvered with documents and a good attorney. A public accusation in a territory where reputation was currency, where women who didn't conform to expected shapes and expected roles were already starting several steps behind, that was harder. That lived in people's minds before the evidence could get there. That was what Dorothea had understood when she filed it and why she'd filed it. The feast was the answer. Abigail had known it from the moment she'd said it, not because it would resolve the legal complaint the attorney was handling that, and the records were clean, and Dorothea's witnesses, when examined, turned out to consist of one man who'd seen Abigail hand a jar of preserves to the Calloway widow and had apparently decided that charitable exchange was evidence of financial fraud. But because the feast would do something legal, documents couldn't. It would let 100 people see exactly what she'd built. She had 2 weeks. She used every hour of them. The planning was a kind of joy she hadn't expected, not the grim determination of the first weeks when she'd been cleaning and counting and building against an uncertain future. This was something different, the particular energy of a woman who knows what she has and is finally able to lay it out in full. She calculated portions for 120 people, and then rounded up by 20% for weather contingencies and the universal truth that men who've been working in cold weather eat more than any reasonable calculation predicts. She organized the kitchen stores with the feast as the target, and found that she had more than enough, which was the point, which was the whole point, which was what she'd been building toward since October. Cole helped. That surprised her, or rather the way he helped surprised her. He didn't delegate. He came to the kitchen in the early mornings and sat on his crate and asked what was needed, and then went and did it with a directness she'd come to recognize as his natural mode when he was fully present without the grief fog between him and the world. He negotiated with 2 neighboring ranchers to borrow extra tables. He put Dix in charge of setting them up in the main house's large front room, which hadn't been used for a gathering in 2 years. He asked Pearl, who had a talent for the decorative side of things that she'd never been given room to use, what could be done with lanterns and pine boughs, and then obtained what Pearl asked for without questioning any of it. "You're good at this," Abigail told him on the 5th day of planning when he came back from a supply run with 3 items she'd asked for and 2 she hadn't but needed. "I used to be," he said. He set the supplies on the counter and looked at them. "Martha and we gave this kind of gathering every winter. She loved it. She'd spend 2 weeks beforehand." He stopped. "She'd have liked you," he said. "It was simply stated, no performance in it." "I think I'd have liked her," Abigail said. He nodded once. Then he picked up the inventory list and said, "What else do we need?" And they went back to work. The thing about building something real in front of people who've been told it's false is that the truth has to be undeniable. Not just credible, undeniable. Abigail understood this the way she understood preservation chemistry. The ratio had to be exactly right or it didn't hold. So she was meticulous. Every dish for the feast had a supply chain she could document. Every jar on the table had a corresponding ledger entry. She prepared a simple, clear summary of the kitchen's accounts, not the long, detailed records, but a clean single page that showed income and outgo, and the math that proved both the kind of document you could hand to a skeptic and watch the skepticism fail because the numbers just worked. She didn't tell Cole about the summary. She put it in her apron pocket the morning of the feast and left it there a quiet weight against her hip and waited to see if she'd need it. She thought she would. The morning of the feast, Abigail woke before 4. She lay still for a moment in the dark of the stone kitchen she'd taken to sleeping in the small room off the back warmer than it had been in the fall, now that she'd properly insulated it, and ran through the day's schedule in her mind. The bread needed to go in at 4:30, the large venison roast at 6, beans at 7, pies in stages throughout the morning. The community soup, the big batch, the one she'd been building the base for all week, needed constant attention for the last 3 hours before serving. It was going to be a long day. She got up and started the bread. By 8 in the morning, the kitchen was operating at full capacity. Pearl was there, and 2 settlement women who'd ridden in the night before, and who Abigail had recruited specifically because they were known and trusted in the valley, and because one of them, Mrs. Henley, was the finest pie maker in the territory and had been delighted to be asked. Hector moved in and out, managing logistics reporting on the arrival of families from the surrounding settlements. Cole appeared twice, once to confirm headcount had reached 90 once, to tell her that 2 of the tables needed to be rearranged to accommodate a family with a wagon that couldn't be left outside in the cold, which she solved in 30 seconds by reconfiguring the service layout she'd planned, which made him look at her with that look she was getting better at identifying. At 9:15, Hector appeared in the doorway with his hat in his hands and a specific expression. "Ma'am," he said, "Gerald Crane just rode in." Abigail set down the ladle. Pearl made a small, involuntary sound. "Alone," she said, "with a man I don't recognize. And Dorothea. She came in a hired carriage." Abigail looked at Mrs. Henley, who was watching her with the calm attention of a woman who'd lived 60 years in Wyoming and had seen things. "Keep the pies on schedule," Abigail told her. She took off her apron, smoothed her dress, and walked out. Gerald and Dorothea were in the yard. Cole was already there, standing with Hector, and the quality of his posture was a thing she read immediately. Tightly controlled the anger present, but managed. Dorothea was dressed for company. Not the feast. She hadn't dressed to blend in with 100 Wyoming settlers at a winter gathering. She'd dressed the way she always dressed, which was to say, like a woman who wants to be unmistakably recognizable as a particular kind of woman. "We were invited," Dorothea said before anyone else spoke. "This is a community gathering. We have every right to attend. You filed a fraud complaint against a member of my household, Cole said, and you coordinated with Gerald to misrepresent this ranch's financial position to a business adversary. Those are allegations, Gerald said. He'd recovered something of his old manner. The jovial exterior was back, though it sat differently now, like a coat that didn't quite fit the way it used to. Unproven allegations, I might add, made by a woman who arrived here with no references and no standing, and has been making accusations since her first week. Her records have been verified by 3 independent suppliers, Cole said. Her records, Gerald said with a particular emphasis that dropped the temperature of the air around him, are her records. A woman who can write numbers in a book can write any numbers she chooses. Cole started to answer. Abigail put her hand briefly on his arm, just briefly, just for a second, and stepped forward. "Mr. Crane," she said. "Mrs. Crane, you're welcome to come in." She said it clearly in a carrying voice, because people had started coming out of the main house to see what was happening, and the thing about a public moment is that how you handle it becomes the story. "The feast is for everyone in this valley. Come in and eat." She paused. "But I want you to understand something first. Every record I've kept, every account I've managed, every transaction made through this kitchen, it's all documented. It's documented by me. It's been verified by multiple parties, and it's been reviewed by Mr. Blackstone's attorney. If you've come here today to continue an accusation, I'd encourage you to have a careful look at those records before you do." Dorothea's expression was something to read. She was too controlled to be visibly angry, but there was something in her eyes, the specific frustration of a woman who'd aimed a weapon and watched it not fire. "I've come to a community gathering," she said finally. "Nothing more." "Then come in," Abigail said, "and welcome." She turned and walked back to the kitchen. Behind her, she heard Hector say quietly to Cole, "Well, that was something, boss." She didn't hear Cole's response. The feast started at noon. 114 people sat down to eat at tables that had been pushed together in the main house's big room and overflowed onto temporary arrangements in the covered porch and the large front hall. There was venison roast and community soup and cornbread and pickled vegetables and the pies that Mrs. Henley had produced in quantities that seemed to exceed the laws of space and time, and the preserved apple cider that Abigail had been holding back for exactly this occasion, warm with cinnamon and cloves. Abigail didn't sit. She served. That was where she was most useful, and it was also, she understood clearly, the most visible place to be, moving through the room, with the serving dishes, talking to people she'd traded with, and people she'd never met, remembering names and noting faces, and doing what she'd been doing since she arrived at this ranch in October, seeing people as people worth feeding well. The Calloway widow caught her arm as she passed. Abigail. She said she was one of the few who used her first name, had been since the second time they'd met. "I need you to know, when that woman came to talk to me, Mrs. Crane." Abigail stopped. "When did she come to you?" 10 days ago. Told me all manner of things." The widow's eyes were sharp and clear. She was 70, if she was a day, and she'd been in this territory since before the railroad came through. "Told me you'd been misrepresenting what you were selling me. That the preserves I'd got from you were inferior goods sold at inflated prices." "What did you think?" Abigail said. "I thought she'd clearly never tasted your apple preserves," the widow said, "and I told her so." She squeezed Abigail's arm. "I want you to know, whatever that woman says, this valley knows the difference between a person who helps and a person who harms." Abigail took a breath. "Thank you," she said. "That means a great deal." "Don't thank me for telling the truth, child. Just keep feeding people." She moved on. She served. She watched. What she was watching for was Dorothea's move, because she knew it was coming. People like Dorothea Crane didn't come to a gathering they'd tried to prevent without a purpose. They came because they'd planned something. They came because a public gathering was also a public stage, and they'd decided the stage served their purposes better than absence. It happened at 1:30. Gerald stood up. He did it with the practiced ease of a man who'd given toasts at 100 gatherings and knew the rhythms of it, stood with his glass, waited for the room to begin to quiet, projected his voice with the particular skill of someone who'd learned that volume is less useful than clarity. "I want to say something," he said, "with everyone here, about this ranch, about what's been happening these past weeks." The room was not quite quiet. Not completely, but enough. "There's been talk," Gerald said, "about financial matters, about accusations going back and forth, and I think it's important." He paused, looking around the room with the expression of a man who is about to be reasonable at you, "that this community has the full picture." "Gerald," Cole's voice from his end of the table. "I'll be brief, Cole. I think I'm owed that much." He turned back to the room. "Miss Turner came to this ranch 6 weeks ago without references, without a history anyone here can verify. She immediately involved herself in ranch financial records that were outside the scope of her role. And now my cousin and I find ourselves facing accusations from a woman nobody in this territory knew existed 2 months ago. I'm asking respectfully for this community to consider who they know and who they don't." The room was fully quiet now. Abigail stood with the serving dish in her hands and felt 114 people not quite looking at her, which was its own kind of looking. She thought about her mother, who'd sat in a lawyer's office and said something is wrong and been right. She set the serving dish down on the nearest table. She reached into her apron pocket and took out the single folded page. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform. She just spoke clearly into the quiet room. "Mr. Crane is right that nobody in this territory knew me 2 months ago," she said. "So let me tell you who I am." She looked around the room, not at Gerald, not at Dorothea, at the people. "My name is Abigail Turner. My parents were James and Ruth Turner, who homesteaded outside Cheyenne for 22 years before the fever took them both this past spring. I came to Blackstone Ranch because I needed work, and I was told it was an honest operation. I was given a kitchen that hadn't been used in 15 years and told to make something of it." She held up the paper. "This is a summary of every transaction made through that kitchen in 6 weeks. Every purchase, every sale, every trade, every jar of preserves, every pound of smoked meat, every bushel of grain, every number, verified by Dunmore's grain operation, by the Morrison farm, by the Hendricks family, by the Calloway widow." She nodded to the old woman who sat very straight. "And by Mr. Blackstone's attorney, who will tell you that not 1 cent is unaccounted for." She set the page on the table in front of her. "If Mr. Crane has a specific discrepancy to identify, I invite him to look at those numbers and find it. In front of everyone here." Silence. Gerald's easy manner had developed a hairline crack. Just a small one, but visible. "That's a single page," he said. "It's a summary. Anyone can write a summary." "The full records are in the kitchen," she said. 62 pages, dated, witnessed, and cross-referenced. You're welcome to go look at them." "A woman who's been committing fraud doesn't keep 62 pages of records," said Dix from somewhere in the middle of the room. He said it the way he said most things conversationally, without apparent investment, as though he were simply noting a feature of the landscape. "That ain't how fraud works." A few people laughed, the short, surprised kind. "I've traded with Miss Turner 3 times, said a man Abigail recognized as Henry Morrison. "Every transaction was fair. Every item was exactly what she said it was." He looked at Gerald. "I don't know what you're trying to do here, Mr. Crane, but you're talking about a woman who helped my family get through the first hard weeks of this winter. I'd ask you to be careful." "My wife got a recipe from her," said another voice, a man in the back. Abigail didn't immediately place. "Best bread we've had in 4 years. My wife asks me to be specific about that." A few more laughs. Warmer this time. Gerald was looking at the room with the expression of a man who'd miscalculated. Not panicked men like Gerald didn't panic publicly, but recalibrating again, looking for the angle that was still available. He found Dorothea's eyes across the room. Dorothea gave him a very small shake of her head. And then something happened that Abigail had not planned for. A man stood up near the back of the room. Not a ranch hand, not a settler she recognized. A tall man in a dark coat who'd been sitting quietly throughout the meal, and who she now realized she'd noticed arrive late and hadn't placed. He had a careful, precise manner and a leather case on the floor beside his chair. "My name is Walter Briggs," he said. "I'm an attorney with the Territorial Commerce Office. I was sent here in connection with the complaint filed by Mrs. Crane." He paused. "I've been present for the past hour. I've been listening." The room was absolutely still. "I've also reviewed the relevant records in the past 3 days," he said. "The records kept by Miss Turner and the records kept by Mr. Gerald Crane." He looked at Gerald. "Mr. Crane, are you the Gerald Crane who served as accounts manager for Blackstone Ranch from January of this year through November?" Gerald's jaw tightened. "I am." "Are you the Gerald Crane whose name appears on a series of supplier payment records showing disbursements to 3 entities that upon investigation do not appear to exist as registered businesses in this territory?" The sound Gerald made was not quite a word. "I have a warrant," Briggs said, "for your attendance before the Territorial Commerce Court in Laramie on the 14th of January to answer questions regarding those disbursements." He reached into the leather case and produced a document. "I was asked to present this at the earliest available opportunity." He looked around the room. "I thought a community gathering might be that opportunity." Gerald's face had gone a color that Abigail had never seen on a human face before. Dorothea was on her feet. This is an ambush," she said. "This was planned." "Mrs. Crane," Briggs said with the infinite patience of a man whose job is to be unflappable. "I was asked by the Commerce Office to deliver this warrant. I chose to do so here because Mr. Crane is here. That's the full extent of the planning involved." He walked across the room and handed Gerald the document. Gerald took it because there was nothing else to do. The room watched. Dorothea looked at Abigail. Across the tables, across the 100 people, through the warm lantern light and the smell of food, and the absolute silence of a community that had just watched something happen that would be talked about in this valley for a long time. "You knew," Dorothea said. Her voice was stripped of everything, the composure, the management, all of it. Just the bare truth of a woman who'd made her best move and lost. "You knew he was coming." "I didn't," Abigail said honestly. "I had no idea." Dorothea stared at her. "Then how—" "Because I kept honest records," Abigail said. "That's all I did. I kept honest records from the beginning, and honest records, given enough time, find their way to the places that need to see them." She paused. "That's how it works, Mrs. Crane. It doesn't always look like that, but that's how it works." Dorothea sat down. Gerald sat down. The room was still for another moment. Then Dix picked up his fork and said, "Miss Turner, is there more of that cornbread?" And the room came back to life around that question, like a fire catching, and people started talking and passing dishes, and the sound of 100 people eating together filled the main house of Blackstone Ranch for the first time in 2 years. Cole found her in the kitchen an hour later when most of the serving was done, and Pearl and Mrs. Henley were managing the remaining plates, and Abigail had finally sat down on her crate with a piece of cornbread and a cup of coffee, and the specific exhaustion of a person who has been running on will and planning for 2 weeks, and has finally put the weight down. He sat on his crate. He had his coffee. They sat in companionable silence for a moment. "Briggs," she said, "the attorney. Did you know he was coming?" "I knew he'd been sent," Cole said. "I didn't know he'd be at the feast. He didn't tell me he was coming today." "It was effective," she said. "It was more than effective." He looked at her. "Gerald's going to face a proper inquiry. The warrant covers 3 months of transactions. With what we've documented and what Briggs has found independently." He shook his head. "He won't be troubling this ranch again." "And Dorothea, she was Gerald's instrument in this more than the other way around, I think. If she cooperates with the inquiry, they may not pursue her. If she doesn't—" He shrugged. "That's her choice to make." Abigail ate her cornbread. Outside, she could hear the sounds of 100 people who'd eaten well and were in no hurry to leave. The feast was still going, would go for another hour at least, probably more. The Calloway widow was almost certainly still holding court at the end of the main table. Mrs. Henley's pies had been discussed in terms Abigail had found genuinely touching. Henry Morrison had asked twice whether the kitchen would be continuing the trade arrangements through the rest of the winter, and Abigail had said yes, and he'd gone back to his family with the particular relief of a man who'd been worrying about something and could stop. "Abigail," Cole said. She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup, which was how he often looked at something when the thing he was actually looking at was something else. "The past 2 months," he said. What this kitchen has become. What you've done for the people here." He stopped. Started again. I wasn't here. Not really. For a year I wasn't here, and things fell apart the way things fall apart when nobody's paying attention, and I don't... He stopped again. "I don't know how to account for that. The time that was lost. The harm that came to people because I was too deep in my own..." "Cole," she said quietly. He looked up. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his face was open in a way it hadn't been, not in the careful, managed way of a man who's decided to let something show, but the way of a man who's stopped having the energy to keep something hidden. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he said. "I need you to know that. Not as an employer saying it to someone who works for him. As a man." He paused. "As a man who was drowning and watched someone throw him a line and doesn't know how to say what that means." Abigail was quiet for a moment. She thought about the canvas bag, the broken kitchen, the first night on the crate eating biscuits alone in the dark, the 44 jars, and the 3 copies of the records, and the letter she'd sent, and every meal she'd made for 25 men who'd needed feeding. "You didn't drown," she said. "That matters too. Because of you." "Because of you," she said. "I threw a line. You grabbed it. That's 2 people, Cole." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "Stay." One word, not dressed up, not positioned as an offer or a negotiation or an arrangement. Just the truest thing he had. She looked at him. At his face, the grief still in it, but grief as something carried rather than something crushing. At the man who'd driven the wagon to Laramie and sat on a crate every evening and remembered how to pay attention and how to care. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Outside, the feast went on. The lanterns burned. 100 people who'd made it through the first hard weeks of winter sat together in the warmth that Abigail Turner had built from nothing and ate the food she'd preserved and planned and prepared and the valley held. The word "stay" lived in the kitchen with her after that. Not as a demand, not as a complication, just as a thing that had been said honestly by a man who didn't waste honest words, sitting in the quiet after a feast that had fed 114 people and dismantled a conspiracy that had been 6 months in the building. Abigail turned it over in her mind the way she turned over problems, not anxiously, but with the steady, methodical attention she gave to anything that mattered. She'd said she wasn't going anywhere, and she'd meant it, and the space between what she'd meant and what he'd been asking was a space she wasn't ready to cross yet. But she knew it was there. She knew because she'd stopped not noticing him. That was the honest way to put it. For the first weeks, she'd observed Cole Blackstone the way she observed everything, clinically usefully gathering information she needed to navigate a complicated situation. She'd cataloged his habits and his grief and his capacity, and she'd filed them. That was all it had been. At some point, she couldn't have named the exact moment, which was itself informative. It had become something else. She'd started noticing when he came into the kitchen, the way you notice weather changing, a shift in the air, a particular quality of attention coming to life in her chest that wasn't clinical or useful and couldn't be filed. She didn't tell anyone this. She made breakfast. The morning after the feast, the ranch had a particular quality of aftermath, the specific stillness of a place where something large has happened and the people in it are quietly absorbing what it means. The hands moved through their morning work without their usual noise. Pearl arrived early and helped without being asked. Hector drank 3 cups of coffee at the workbench and stared at the middle distance and finally said, "Well, ma'am, that was a feast," in a tone that made the word mean considerably more than food. "It was," she agreed. "Gerald's going to fight the warrant. He'll lose. Probably, but it'll take time. And Dorothea," he paused. "She's not done. A woman like that doesn't just fold up and go home." "I know," Abigail said. "You're not worried." She looked at him. "I'm practical. Worry is what you do when you don't have a plan." "I have a plan." Hector smiled into his coffee. "Yes, ma'am. I reckon you do." Cole came in at 7, which was earlier than usual, and stood at the counter and picked up the inventory book, the way he'd taken to doing not reading it exactly. More orienting himself the way some people need to hold something familiar when they're thinking about something else. "Briggs came to see me this morning," he said. Abigail looked up. "He's going back to Laramie today. He wanted me to know that the complaint against you has been formally withdrawn. His office reviewed the records and found no basis for it." He set the inventory book down. "It's done. Officially." She let herself feel that for a moment. Just a moment, the clean, uncomplicated relief of having something that had been hanging over her simply removed. Then she nodded and went back to what she was doing. "Good," she said. "That's all? Good. What else would you like me to say?" "I don't know. Something more than good. Dorothea filed that complaint to destroy you." "And it didn't work," she said. "So. Good." He watched her for a moment with that particular expression she'd cataloged and stopped being able to catalog. Then he sat on his crate and accepted the coffee she set in front of him and didn't say anything else for a while. Pearl came in with the morning eggs and a look on her face that meant she had news she was deciding how to deliver. "Mrs. Calloway is outside," she said. "She brought Mrs. Morrison and the Hendricks girl. They said they've come to help with the cleanup from yesterday." Abigail raised an eyebrow. "The cleanup's done. We finished last night." "I know," Pearl said. "I told them that." She paused. "They said they'd come anyway." Cole made a sound that was fully a smile finally out loud. "I think," he said, "they've come to see how you are." He was right. The 3 women came in and established themselves at the workbenches with the comfortable authority of women who've decided somewhere is a place they're welcome. And within 20 minutes, the kitchen had the quality of a different kind of gathering. Quieter than the feast, more domestic, with the particular warmth of women talking while their hands are busy, which is a different kind of warmth than any other. Mrs. Calloway, who'd made her position clear the night before at the feast table, sat closest to the stove and addressed herself to Abigail with the directness of someone who's earned the right to be direct. "That woman is still in town," she said. "Dorothea Crane. She's at the hotel, and she's been talking to anyone who'll listen." "What's she saying?" Abigail said. "That last night was a performance. That you arranged the whole thing, including that attorney appearing." She picked up a pea pod and started shelling. "She's also saying..." A pause. "She's saying that your relationship with Mr. Blackstone isn't appropriate. That you've positioned yourself to take advantage of a widower in a vulnerable state." The kitchen was quiet. Pearl at the far counter didn't look up, but had gone very still. Cole on his crate set down his coffee. "She's saying that," he said. His voice was even, almost too even. "Cole," Abigail said quietly. "I heard it," he said. He stood up. "I'm going to go." "Sit down," she said. He looked at her. "Sit down," she said again, with the same tone she used when the bread needed watching and someone was about to let the heat get away. Getting on a horse and riding to town to confront Dorothea Crane about a rumor is exactly what she wants. It proves the rumor. He stood for a moment longer. Then he sat. "She's been losing ground since the feast," Abigail said, addressing herself to Mrs. Calloway as much as to Cole. "She filed a complaint that's been withdrawn. The man she was working with is facing a warrant. Mercer is gone. She has nothing left but talk and talk in a town where 114 people ate last night and watched Gerald get served a warrant at the dinner table." She paused. "Talk will run out of air on its own." "It might," Mrs. Calloway said. Or it might not. This is a small territory. Reputations. Mrs. Calloway. Abigail looked at her. Do you believe what she's saying? Lord, no, child. Does Mrs. Morrison? Certainly not. Does anyone in this room? A short silence. Then Mrs. Morrison said, There's a difference between what people believe and what people repeat. There is, Abigail said. And the only answer to what people repeat is what people see. They saw the feast. They saw the records. They'll keep seeing this kitchen and the work it does and the people it feeds. She went back to what she'd been doing. Let Dorothea talk. The truth doesn't need defending. It just needs time. The room settled. Hands went back to work. Conversation moved to other things. Spring planting and the Morrison family's new barn, and a recipe dispute between Mrs. Calloway and Mrs. Morrison that had apparently been ongoing for 3 years and showed no signs of resolution. Abigail worked and listened and felt the particular quality of a kitchen that has become something beyond a kitchen, a place where the community breathes, where news moves, where women sit with their hands busy and speak the truth to each other with the ease of people who've decided this place is safe. She'd built this, not alone, but she'd started it in the dark with a broken stove and a canvas bag, and it had grown into this. She let herself feel that too. The twist came 3 days later, and it came from a direction she genuinely hadn't expected. She was in the supply barn doing inventory, still always the inventory which was the spine of everything she built when Ames walked in. She startled. She didn't startle easily, and she was briefly annoyed at herself for it. Ames, she said. I thought Mercer's party left. They did, he said. I came back. He stood with his hat in his hands and the particular manner of a man who has rehearsed what he's going to say and is now in the moment of saying it and finding it harder than rehearsal. I need to tell you something, he said. About Mercer, about what he's planning now. She set down her pen. Tell me. He's not done with this ranch. The settlement agreement had closed off the direct approach. But Mercer has been operating in this territory for 20 years, and he has... Ames paused. He has relationships with certain members of the Territorial Land Board, men who can create complications for a ranch that's had legal irregularities in its recent history, even if those irregularities were committed by someone else. What kind of complications? Inspection claims, boundary disputes that get filed and take years to resolve, supply contract reviews that freeze normal operations. He looked at her steadily. He can't buy this ranch, but he can make it difficult to operate until it becomes easier to sell than to fight. Abigail thought about this for a moment. Why are you telling me this? He was quiet for a beat. Because I've worked for Silas Mercer for 20 years, he said. And in 20 years, I have watched him do this to 6 ranches. I watched those families fight and fail and leave, and I told myself it was business, and that wasn't the same as harm, and... He stopped. You sat in that kitchen and answered every question he asked, and served him coffee he didn't deserve, and didn't flinch once. I've sat across from men with armies behind them who flinched. He put his hat on. I reckon it was time I stopped telling myself there wasn't anything to be done about it. Abigail looked at him for a long moment. Would you be willing to make a statement, she said, in writing, about what you've observed, about the pattern of what Mercer does? That's why I came back, he said. She took him to Cole's attorney that same afternoon. The statement Ames made was 4 pages. He was precise and specific and named dates and locations and the names of the 6 ranches he'd mentioned. Cole's attorney read it twice and looked up with the expression of a man who has just been handed something considerably more significant than he'd expected. This, he said carefully, is not just useful for Blackstone Ranch. No, Ames said, it isn't. This could be the basis for a territory-wide inquiry into Mercer's operations. I know what it could be, Ames said. That's why I wrote it. Abigail watched Cole take that in, watched him process the scope of it, not just the immediate protection of his ranch, but the larger implication, the idea that the thing they'd been fighting wasn't just a local predator, but a systematic one, and that the fight they'd been in had produced something that could help people who were still years away from knowing they'd need it. He looked at her. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He looked back at the attorney. What do we need to do? The legal process that followed took most of January, and it was not dramatic in the way the feast had been dramatic. It was the slow, methodical work of documentation and testimony, and formal processes moving at the pace formal processes move, which is slower than anyone wants and faster than disaster requires. Cole was present for all of it. He drove himself to Laramie twice and corresponded daily with the attorney and reviewed every document with the focused attention of a man who had learned at considerable cost what happens when you stop paying attention. Abigail ran the ranch, not officially, not by any title anyone had given her. But the operations of Blackstone Ranch moved through her kitchen the way blood moves through a body. Everything that mattered about the day-to-day survival of the people on that land connected to what happened in the stone building that had been a ruin in October. The hands came to her with questions. The suppliers sent their riders to her first. The settlement families who traded with the ranch traded through her, and the accounts she kept were clean and specific and growing month by month into a record that would have been impossible to imagine from the outside of a broken kitchen in the dark. Pearl had become her second in all but name. The girl who'd watched her with wide eyes in the main house kitchen in October could now run the provisioning independently for 3 days at a stretch, kept her own records in a neat, precise hand, and had recently begun making suggestions that Abigail found genuinely useful, which she told her directly, and watched Pearl receive with the particular emotion of someone who has been capable for years and is hearing it confirmed for the first time. "You should teach," Abigail told her one afternoon. Pearl looked at her. "Teach who?" "Anyone. There are women in this valley who don't know what you know. About preservation, about accounts about the mathematics of feeding people through a hard winter." She looked at the girl who'd arrived at this kitchen nervous and had become something considerably more. Knowledge kept to yourself is half-wasted. Pearl thought about it. Would you help me with how to structure it?" "Of course," Abigail said. It was in the middle of this, in the middle of the legal process, and the winter operations, and the slow, steady building of everything she'd been building, that Cole came to the kitchen on an evening in late January and didn't sit on his crate. He stood, in the middle of the kitchen, with his hat in his hands, in the way he only held it when he was about to say something he'd thought about carefully. She turned from the stove and looked at him. "I've been trying to find the right way to say this for 3 weeks, he said. "Every time I come in here, I think tonight is the night I'm going to say it right. And then I sit down and we talk about supplies and the legal business and Pearl's teaching idea and the spring planting, and I don't say it." "Then say it," she said. He looked at her. Just looked for a moment with that open quality she'd stopped being able to catalog. "I love you," he said. "I know the timing is. I know it's complicated. I know I'm a man who's been half present for a year, and I don't have the right to ask you to bet on me coming back the rest of the way. But I need you to know it. Because you came into a place that was falling apart, and you put it back together, and somewhere in the middle of watching you do that, I fell in love with you. Not with what you did, with who you are." He paused. The woman who throws a skillet through a window at midnight, rather than sit down and cry. She stared at him. "You know about that?" "Stu told me. The wagon driver. He heard it from a hand who saw the window." Something in his face had gone warm in a way she hadn't seen before. He said he knew then that whoever was going to be in that kitchen was going to be something. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the morning she'd arrived with the canvas bag, the first night on the crate, the 43 jars and the mice and the broken flue and the biscuits she'd eaten alone in the dark. She thought about all the things she'd built since then, and the man who'd sat on a crate every evening, and remembered how to be present, and the valley outside that was going to make it through the winter because someone had paid attention. "Cole," she said, "you don't have to—" "I love you too," she said. "I've been trying to find the right way to say that for about 3 weeks as well." He laughed. Actually laughed, the full, unguarded sound of a man who has been a long time without it, and it filled the kitchen the way warmth fills a cold room. He crossed to her. He took her hands in both of his, work-roughened hands, careful hands, the hands of a man who was learning to hold things again. He looked at her the way you look at something you couldn't see clearly and can now see. "Marry me," he said. "Not because you need someone to take care of you. Lord knows you don't need that. Not because I need—" He stopped. "Because I want to build something, the right way from the beginning, with someone who knows what building costs and does it anyway." She looked at his face. She thought about her mother who'd said something is wrong, who'd read a contract once and known the truth of it. She thought about what her mother would have said about this man, this kitchen, this valley in winter with the lanterns burning. She thought her mother would have said, "Yes, obviously. Now stop standing there and get back to work." "Yes," she said. He held her hands tighter. Outside, the Wyoming winter was in its deepest month. The cold that came in late January in the territory was a different animal than December cold, not the sharp, dramatic cold of the first storms, but the settled, permanent cold of a winter that has committed itself, that has decided it owns the land and means to keep it. It pressed against the stone walls and found them solid. It tested the roof and found it repaired. It moved through the yard and the barn and the pastures and met cattle that had been fed through the stores that Abigail had built. Met men who had eaten well all winter. Met a ranch that had been falling apart in October and had not fallen. Dorothea Crane left Laramie in the second week of February. No announcement. No final confrontation. She was there, and then she wasn't the way people leave when they've run out of moves and understand it. Hector reported it to Abigail without drama in the middle of a morning's work. "Mrs. Crane's gone. Hotel says she paid her bill and took the stage east." "All right," Abigail said and kept working. Gerald's case before the Territorial Commerce Court concluded in March. The evidence was not subtle. 3 fictional supplier accounts, 11 months of systematic diversions, the letters to Mercer's office laid out in sequence by an attorney who had Abigail's records as the factual backbone of every claim. It was the kind of case that doesn't produce drama in the courtroom because the outcome is clear before it starts. Gerald Crane was found liable for fraudulent misappropriation of ranch funds in the amount of $4,216 over 11 months. He was ordered to make restitution and was barred from serving in any financial management capacity in the Wyoming Territory. Cole came back from Laramie with the judgment and set it on Abigail's workbench without comment and looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "Martha would have been sick about this, about Gerald." "I know," Abigail said. She trusted him completely. She brought him here because she trusted him. He was quiet. "I keep thinking about how I should have seen it. Should have noticed." "Cole, you were grieving. That's not an excuse for—" "It's not an excuse," she said. "It's a reason. There's a difference." She looked at him. "You see it now. You saw it when it mattered. You saw it, and you chose right." She paused. Martha would be glad about that part. He took a breath, nodded once. Then he picked up the judgment folded, put it in his coat pocket, and said, "When do you want to have the wedding?" She looked at him. "Are you asking me when I want to have it, or are you telling me you want to have it soon?" "Both," he said with the complete honesty that was becoming one of her favorite things about him. "Spring," she said. "When the ground is thawed and the planting is done and people can travel. I want the people from this valley to be there. All 114 of them. More by then," she said. "Word gets out." He smiled. "All right, spring." The Mercer inquiry that grew from Ames's statement moved slowly through the winter and spring, the way legal processes move, accumulating, building, adding testimony from the families of the 6 ranches Ames had named until it was too large and too well documented for anyone to redirect or bury. Abigail followed it from a distance, through the attorney's updates to Cole, with the particular feeling of watching something she'd set in motion complete its path. She hadn't planned Ames. She hadn't planned his conscience or his decision to come back, or the 4 pages of specific dated testimony he'd provided. But she'd been the kind of person that kind of decision gets made toward, and that was the only version of planning she'd ever believed in. The spring came early that year, which Abigail took as the territory showing off. The garden she'd planned all winter went in through April and was established by May. She'd expanded it considerably from the half-wild patch she'd reclaimed in the fall proper. Beds now planned and seated with the precision of a woman who'd been thinking about it for 6 months. She had Pearl learning the herb section, and 2 of the hand's younger brothers learning the root vegetables, and a proper plot of wheat that, if the summer cooperated, would supply a significant portion of the ranch's flour needs by harvest. She was on her knees in the herb beds on a morning in mid-May when Mrs. Calloway appeared at the garden fence. Abigail. She sat back on her heels. "Mrs. Calloway, I didn't know you were coming today." "I wasn't planning to." The old woman looked at the garden with the expression of someone assessing serious work. "Pearl came to give the first of her teaching sessions at the Morrison place yesterday." "I know. How was it?" "She was—" Mrs. Calloway paused. "She was very good. She had notes. She had examples. She answered questions better than most teachers half her age." She looked at Abigail. "That girl was drowning in that main house kitchen when you got here." "She needed room," Abigail said. "She needed someone to tell her she was worth making room for." Mrs. Calloway was quiet for a moment. "You've done that for more people than you know. This winter. What this ranch was what it is now." She paused. "I just wanted to say it to your face." Abigail looked at her. At the woman who'd trusted her from the beginning, who'd squeezed her arm at the feast and told her to keep feeding people. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. Keep gardening." Mrs. Calloway turned to go. "And that wedding better have good food." "Mrs. Calloway," Abigail said. The old woman looked back. "Will you come early? The day of, I could use someone in the kitchen who knows what they're doing." Mrs. Calloway's face did something complicated and then settled into the particular warmth of a woman who has been asked the right thing at the right time. "I'll be there before sunrise," she said. The wedding was on the first Saturday of June, on a morning when the Wyoming sky was the particular clean blue that only happens after rain, and the grass was as green as it ever gets in the territory, which is greener than people expect. Abigail had been right about the numbers. There were more than 114, because word had gotten out the way she'd known it would, and because the story of what had happened at Blackstone Ranch over the winter had traveled the way stories travel in small territories, person to person across fence lines and trade routes, and the natural human need to tell each other about things that turn out right. She stood in the kitchen before the ceremony. Her kitchen, the stone building that had been a ruin, and was now the center of everything, and looked at what was ready. The food for the reception laid out in organized abundance enough for 140 people, and then some, because she had never once in her life stopped at enough. Mrs. Calloway was there, and Pearl and Mrs. Henley with her pies, and 3 women from the valley who'd become regulars in the teaching sessions Pearl ran. And the kitchen was warm and busy, and full of the sound of people doing work they were good at. Pearl looked at her. "You should go get ready." "I am ready." "You're covered in flour." Abigail looked at her hands. "I made a pie." "You made 3 pies." "The third one is better," Abigail said. But she took off her apron and handed it to Pearl and went to the small room off the back where her dress was hanging. She'd made the dress herself over the winter evenings from fabric Cole had brought back from Laramie without being asked, blue wool, good quality, the color of the sky that morning. She'd made it plain and well-fitted and warm because she was a practical woman, and she was not going to be cold at her own wedding. She'd put a row of small buttons down the front that had taken her 3 evenings to attach, and were she thought exactly right. She put it on. She looked at herself in the small mirror. She looked like herself, broad and solid and plain, and herself in a blue dress with good buttons in the kitchen she'd built from nothing. She thought about the woman who'd stepped down from Stu's wagon in October with a canvas bag that wasn't even full, who'd stood in the yard and looked at the broken building at the bottom of the slope and said, "I'll need a lamp." "Ready?" Pearl said from the doorway. "Yes," Abigail said. Cole was waiting at the end of the path between the kitchen and the main house, which was where they'd decided to stand, not in a church, because the church in town was 20 miles away. and neither of them were particularly invested in the building, and not in the main house either, but out here in the space between the kitchen and everything else, which was the space where the ranch actually lived. He had his good hat on, and his face was doing the thing she loved about his face, which was being completely unguardedly present. He looked at her walking toward him, and his expression said everything that needed saying. The judge who'd come from Laramie said the words. They said their words back. The valley watched. Hector, who was standing closest, was holding his hat in both hands, with the particular intensity of a man trying not to show that he's moved. Dix, who was next to him, was not trying as hard. He had his handkerchief out and was not apologetic about it. Mrs. Calloway was smiling the way people smile when something confirms what they already knew. When it was done, when the judge said the last words, and Cole took her hands and looked at her, there was a sound from the assembled crowd that was part applause and part something quieter, the sound of a community exhaling something it had been holding all winter, the particular release of people who have been through something difficult together and have come out the other side. Cole leaned down and said quietly against her ear, "The third pie is the best thing you've ever made." She pulled back to look at him. "You ate it already." "Just a piece, to check." Cole Blackstone, that pie was for the reception. "It's magnificent," he said with complete sincerity and not a shred of apology. "Everyone's going to be very impressed." She looked at him. His face. The openness in it, the ease, the man who had been hollowed out by grief and had come back, not unchanged, not pretending the loss wasn't there, but back present, capable of standing in the June sun and stealing pie and looking at her like she was the thing that made sense of everything. She started laughing, full and unguarded, the kind she'd been too careful to give herself for a long time. He laughed with her. Behind them, the valley gathered for the feast. That evening, when most of the guests had eaten their fill and drifted into the long Wyoming twilight, Abigail stood at the kitchen door and looked at what she had. Not cataloging it this time. Not calculating or planning or problem-solving. Just looking. Hector was at the fence with two of the younger hands telling a story that was making them laugh. Pearl was at the table with Mrs. Morrison's daughter. The two of them bent over something Pearl was explaining with the focused patience of a natural teacher. The Calloway widow had cornered the judge and was telling him something that had him nodding very seriously. Dix was asleep in a chair in the corner with his hat over his face, which seemed exactly right. Cole came to stand beside her. They stood together in the kitchen doorway, looking at the valley, in the last light at the people, and the spring grass, and the ranch that had been dying and had not died. "What are you thinking?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "I'm thinking about October," she said. "The first night. The biscuits I ate alone in the dark. And now," she looked at the valley, at the 140 people who'd eaten the food she'd built from a broken kitchen, and an instinct that worth was something you proved with your hands. At the husband beside her, who'd been drowning and had grabbed the line. At the work that was never finished, and the winter that had not beaten them, and the spring that had come anyway. The way spring always comes, not because it's earned, but because that's what seasons do when you hold on long enough. "Now," she said, "I'm thinking about what the garden needs in the morning." Cole put his arm around her. Outside, the last light moved across the Wyoming plains in the long, golden, unhurried way of a June evening that has nowhere it needs to be. The valley held everything she'd built. The stone kitchen behind her glowed with warmth. The people she'd fed were fed and full, and here, Abigail Turner had arrived with nothing and built everything, and the life she made in that forgotten kitchen became the beating heart of a valley that would never forget the woman who refused to quit.